Make up mind. Fight.
This may be a controversial take, but I think it goes without saying that pretty much every weapon and playstyle in TF2 requires skill to some extent. Even the most ideologically brain-dead strategies still ask for some degree of game sense, positioning, matchup knowledge, and timing from the player. Every strategy can fail if performed improperly, and virtually every strategy can flourish if used in the right hands. However, I think it also goes without saying that some TF2 weapons require a bit more mechanical execution than others. In some cases, certain weapons are balanced entirely around these high skill requirements. Weapons that ask for a higher level of technical execution as a base foundational element of their designs. In this video, I want to talk about some of these. These are 4 TF2 items that are explicitly balanced around their high skill minimums. Weapons that, in the hands of a hypothetical perfect player, someone who never misses and never misplays, would be objective upgrades to stock. However, the large amount of mechanical skill necessary to use them consistently keeps them in check under normal conditions. A new or bad player using these weapons will not get the most out of them. I want to stress that I'm aware that any weapon in the game could hypothetically qualify for this. Any weapon would obviously be broken with perfect play or bad with mediocre play, but these are just 4 weapons that I perceive to epitomize this design philosophy the most. That said, let's roll.
The axe.
Oh god, the crows.
Come here, sweetheart.
The direct hit is probably the poster child for this dynamic within TF2. It's a weapon that, in the hands of someone who never made mistakes and played optimally at every moment, would make it a theoretical direct upgrade to the stock rocket launcher. However, it's balanced out by having an extremely punishing single downside. A downside that makes the weapon pretty much as inaccessible as it gets to a prospective new player. At a base, the direct hit is an unlockable rocket launcher for Soldier with a whopping 3 upsides, and when you first see them, they're pretty damn appealing upsides. It deals more damage than the stock rocket launcher, its rockets travel significantly faster, and it deals guaranteed mini-crits to enemies knocked into the air by explosives, grapple hooks, or rocket packs. These 3 upsides are huge and some of the objective best that a TF2 weapon can have. Flat increased damage, a faster, easier to land projectile, and even more extra damage on top of that in a common situation. It can handily one-shot light classes, and with proper usage can easily 2-shot most power classes. What's not to like? Well, these incredibly appealing upsides of the direct hit are balanced out by a single, deceptively crushing negative that makes it a side grade in the purest sense of the word. A 70% smaller explosive radius. That means that this weapon only has 30% of the splash zone that a stock rocket launcher has, so while a stock rocket might hit an enemy from here, the direct hit will only hit enemies from here. I don't think it can be understated just how important splash damage is to Soldier's general game plan. Due to the speed and predictable trajectory of Soldier's rockets, a big part of playing the class effectively boils down to predicting where enemies will be and setting pseudo-traps using splash damage. If you shoot their feet, they will die. A lot of Soldier players will not exclusively rely on direct hits at the stock rocket launcher, as its slow projectile and generous splash radius make it much more consistent to line up splash hits for massive spread damage. And while a UGC god Soldier let every direct rocket with his medic GF's beam shoved firmly betwixt his cheeks, most players are not these soldiers. The direct hit poises to significantly lower the Soldier's bubble of influence as a class in exchange for more damage with tight precision, sacrificing the consistent safety of splash hits for more devastating damage that's harder to consistently pull off. While you can still go for splash hits, you'll find that the radius is so small you've basically got to be hitting right underneath enemies' feet to land damage, and at that point you might as well just be...
Oh, fuck!
Yeah. On top of that, the faster projectile speed is both a blessing and a curse, as it makes lining up direct hits slightly easier, but also changes the timing just enough from the stock rocket launcher to really throw things off upon first switching. When you get into the groove with the direct hit though, things can really get moving, and you'll quickly find yourself spamming out choke points, diving medics, and just erasing light classes with a consistency and ease that no other weapon in the game can really accomplish. It's a tantalizing weapon that promises big rewards to people who can tame it, but only brings crushing disappointment to those who can't. because for all those big damage, close-range rocket connects, and those one-shot mini-sentries, and those sleek air shots, the direct hit is still a weapon that'll chew you up and spit you out if you can't acclimate to it. There will be times where you beef all of your rockets, there will be times where you can't pin down the enemy, and there will be times where you just can't land a direct hit. And that's what keeps this weapon from being a direct upgrade. It's incredibly powerful, but narrows the margin for error so much that it basically mandates near-perfect play consistently to use efficiently. We can all meme about getting lucky and deleting scouts and snipers at close range, but all of those ill-fated mid-range encounters are truly what define this weapon. You've got to land direct hits to use it effectively, and it's simply not realistic to do that every time. Overall, the direct hit may very well be the poster child for a skill-dependent TF2 weapon, and the first one we're discussing in this video for a reason. It's got an incredibly strong set of upsides, and a downside that may seem innocuous at first, but will absolutely break your back and humble you if you use it before you're ready. Also, remember that this is an achievement item on the game's recommended beginner class. That is a sick joke on Valve's part.
With my apologies.
We're going to be deviating from the conventional class order a bit and talking about the Spy next. The Spy has a few weapons that sacrifice the class's personal survivability for powerful upsides, between the Latrange dealing lower damage in exchange for a longer cloak, the Big Earner slightly lowering his health for speedy backstabs, and in the case of the one we'll be talking about in this video, making the Spy both the frailest and tankiest class in the game at once, so long as you're able to consistently make plays. The conniver's kunai. Now, I know having the kunai in this video at all is going to be a bit controversial, as there are certain portions of the TF2 community who view this weapon as borderline brain-dead and over-centralizing the Spy as a class. However, as a heavy main who's frequently on the receiving end of this weapon, I thoroughly believe that the negative base this weapon starts the player at can easily make it among the most newcomer-unfriendly weapons in the game. The conniver's kunai is a knife for Spy that makes him start each life at an enormous 70 HP. This is the lowest base health that a class can naturally be at any point in the entire game, and puts the Spy in one-shot range of pretty much every form of burst damage in the entire game. I think it goes without saying how massive of a downside this is, as a Spy without proper game sense or situational awareness or just bad loadout synergy can be capital F fucked before they can get a chance to make a move using this thing. The kunai requires a clean mix of carefully picking your battles and hyper backstab offense in those battles to use effectively. And how are you rewarded for performing this balancing act?
The candles just keep moving.
Soldier, need help!
He's really just leaving me here. He gave me his energy and left me. Maybe this is a sign. Maybe I should change. Maybe this is my second and last chance. Maybe I was wrong. Nah.
Gentlemen?
Pretty damn handsomely, I'd say. Backstabbing an enemy with the conniver's kunai allows the Spy to sap their health, gaining a maximum of around 210 health of overheal. A kunai backstab also immediately cleanses the Spy of most negative damage dealing status effects like afterburn or bleed. This allows a single well-timed kunai stab to make the Spy the literal second tankiest class in the game, immediately empower himself to tough out or escape a tricky situation, and chain together incredibly tanky stabs that make him nigh unkillable. Combining the kunai with the dead ringer and a strong revolver can make the Spy an extremely potent force in terms of both dealing damage and tanking, and it can be a true ordeal to put one down once they get rolling. The sheer difference between a kunai Spy fresh out of spawn and a kunai Spy after a single backstab is pretty staggering, coupled with the fact that all it takes is that single backstab for a kunai Spy to completely undo any damage or debuffs you've done to him, and you've got a recipe for a Frenchman that's hard to put down. It's all around an extremely powerful and tough to surmount unlock in the right hands, and a no-brainer for a Spy player worth their salt. Notice how I said in the right hands and worth their salt though, as for all of the crazy chain stabs and game-winning disruptions you're capable of performing with this knife, you're still beginning each fight with close to half of your standard health, and are extremely susceptible to being killed by a wayward attack before you can even begin to make your move. The amount of clueless, fresh install Spies who find this weapon through random drop are enraptured by its design and reputation, and immediately think that equipping it'll make them Spy main gods, only to be thoroughly and decisively mollywopped by everyone on the enemy team before they can get a backstab, is staggering. In the hands of an experienced player, this knife is borderline broken, but in the vast majority of cases for less experienced players, they'll never get to experience this weapon's true upsides. The fact of the matter is that, despite this weapon being extremely powerful and handily outperforming a lot of Spy's other options if used well, it's still a knife that requires keen game sense, loadout synergy, and the ability to attack opportunistically to use effectively. You literally have the lowest base health under the game's normal rules, and you have to land at least one backstab before those crazy rolls can begin. This alone keeps the kunai from being an entirely over-centralizing best-in-slot pick. While you could definitely argue that it is that, there are players who will be unable to fully capitalize on its strength, and there will be times where the circumstances of the match do not favor using the kunai. 70 health is very easy to lose in TF2. Keep in mind that a default heavy has more than 4 times as much HP as you do when you equip this thing. You can get tanky, but you have to be able to put in the work to reach that point. The kunai is such an interesting weapon to me because the way the TF2 community talks about it, you'd think it was nigh unbeatable. Like, this thing single-handedly makes Spy the strongest class in the game. But the fact of the matter is that a 55% max health decrease is still an enormous barrier to entry for a new player, or even an experienced one who's used to using other knives. That just speaks to the strength of health on kill though. If you can secure those picks, more are likely to come.
Start praying, boy.
Engineer isn't famous for being a particularly execution-heavy class. That's not to say that he doesn't require skill, far from it. However, the skills that go into high-level engineer play tend to be a bit different than high-level play with other classes. It's resource management, risk assessment, map knowledge, knowing when and where to place buildings, knowing when to get out of there, stuff like that makes the engineer an especially skill-based class. And while the basic principles of aiming your gun and fighting enemies still apply, he's largely a multitasker whose job it is to facilitate the entire rest of the team's effort on his own over participating in one-on-one gunfights. And then there's the Widowmaker. This is a gun that poises to turn Engineer into a high-execution, high-risk gunfighter that his Texan blood bore him to be. It's a gun that somehow runs directly in opposition to the Engineer's base function as a class, yet is somehow also incredibly functional and fun in the right hands. And, unlike the Overwatch hero who it shares its name with, it's never had to receive a nerf. So what makes the Widowmaker tick, and why is it such a standout weapon in Engineer's lineup? Well, it's a shotgun that has the same amount of damage, the same rate of fire, and the same amount of pellets as the stock shotgun. It can also fire a total of 6 missed shots before being spent, which also aligns it with Engineer stock. While it may sound like a simple reskin, you might have noticed that I said the word miss, and that's because the Widowmaker has no ammo, and instead draws from the Engineer's metal supply as a source of determining how many shots it can fire. Each shot fired takes 30 metal, again allowing it a maximum of 6 missed shots, but the kicker is that the gun restores exactly 1 point of metal for each point of damage done, and with a maximum ramp-up damage of 90, you can potentially get back more than double the metal you spend with each shot. In addition, the gun never needs to reload so long as you have metal, so with true aim at a close enough distance, you can theoretically hammer away enemies until there's none left to shoot at. This all around makes the Widowmaker a frightening close-range damage dealer within the Engineer's lineup that facilitates an extremely aggressive battle engineer playstyle. It also has a stat that allows you to deal 10% extra damage to enemies being targeted by your sentry, which makes it a pretty transparent attempt to encourage engineers to have sentries up alongside this weapon. And that's the thing. The Widowmaker, by its very nature, exists contrary to Engineer's base role as a class. The metal you're supposed to use to build helpful dispensers and teleporters for your team is instead used to damage enemies, and can lead to both you and your team finding yourselves in some unfavorable positions. On top of that, if you can't hit your shots, or struggle to find enemies entering your bubble of influence often enough to shoot, then it's pretty much a waste to equip this weapon. It's designed explicitly and wholly to shoot enemies, and is not designed to work around Engineer's buildings, which is a unique trait amongst Engineer's weapons. This ultimately leads to a weapon that one could argue encourages extremely selfish engineer play. It's a gun that spends the engineer's main class-specific resource on something other than helping his team, yet has the potential to output insane damage if used well. And while the tone of my commentary up to this point might seem to have skewed negative, I am speaking in earnest sincerity here when I say that this is one of my favorite guns in the game. Because to me, the Widowmaker is not just about mindlessly hammering away at enemies while neglecting your buildings. If you use this thing to facilitate the building playstyle, it can be an extremely potent backup tool to get your engineer ball rolling. If enemies get a bit too close, if you see a pesky power class encroaching on your turf, or if you're low on metal in a pinch, a few well-placed shots of the Widowmaker can fix all of those problems instantly. It's an alarmingly powerful tool that's genuinely useful for more than the selfishly playing battle engineer. All of that obviously hinges though on being able to hit your shots, and that, alongside knowing when, why, and where to equip this weapon, is what lands it in this video. The widowmaker is interesting because despite the direct hit being the poster child, I'd say this is the purest definition of a skill-dependent unlock in the game. Its true colors only come out when you either miss or hit all of your shots. The only thing it offers with perfect play is being able to fire more and restoring a bit of metal, and the only thing you lose by missing your shots is not being able to fire anymore. If you rest anywhere in the middle ground between hitting some shots and missing others, then you probably won't notice too much of a difference between this and stock. But those golden moments where you're landing all of your shots, just hammering away at the enemy with infinite bullets and they can't get a shot off because you're not relenting, are some of the most fun moments you can have as Engineer. With the right setup, the Widowmaker can be one of the most potent offensive tools in TF2. And yet, even with the worst setup, it's still just a variation of the stock shotgun. You're usually not handicapping yourself by equipping this weapon so long as you can land some bullets. It's all around a weapon that rewards using it in the right circumstances, landing your shots consistently, and knowing when to hold back with your buildings versus when to go on the offensive. I realize that my script has been all over the place during this section, and that's just because the Widowmaker is one of the most uniquely designed weapons in the game. It doesn't have a super class-defining upside or a wholly unique downside. It's an entirely skill-dependent unlock that only hits its full potential if you can land most or all of your shots. It's such a unique weapon within TF2's lineup, and one that I think more people should give an earnest whirl.
All your heads look bloody 12 feet tall.
And lastly, we have Sniper's answer to a skill check unlock, this time being the Bazaar Bargain. This weapon is interesting as an entry for this video because it's also a snowball weapon. These are weapons that start out in an objectively worse position than other weapons in the game, but become progressively stronger as you get kills and play well with them. They follow the fundamental principle of when the ball starts rolling, it'll continue rolling. And while TF2 has plenty of snowball weapons, none of them really have as much overlap between the snowball mechanic and the criteria for this video as the Bazaar Bargain. But why is that? Well, for starters, because it's one of the best weapons in the game. More so than any other weapon on this list, the Bazaar Bargain is truly a weapon that handily outclasses the stock sniper rifle when used by an experienced, skilled player. A competent sniper using this weapon can easily shut down an entire lobby, and it's a very popular choice amongst dedicated sniper mains and less honest players. Its stats are very simple. It starts out with a significantly slower scope charging time than Sniper's other rifles, but steadily increases its charge time as you get headshot kills. This eventually reaches a point where you'll be firing fully charged scope headshots in a little over a second after each one, which allows you to output some insane damage and area control. A sniper who can stay alive, land headshots consistently, can easily become one of the most powerful forces on the map with this weapon in tow. It only takes 3 headshots to start seeing an increase over the stock sniper rifle, and afterwards you can really start feeling this thing snowball. Dropping heavies and soldiers in less than 2 seconds is nothing to sneeze at, and the ease with which it can vaporize light classes is simply absurd. It's an all-around, incredibly powerful, damn near over-centralizing tool for a skilled and consistent sniper. But that really only applies to a skilled sniper, and I can say this because I am not one. This is the only weapon on this list where I can speak from genuine experience towards its nature as a skill-dependent weapon, because the requirement of landing 3 or more headshots in a single life and then staying alive long enough to carry that momentum forward is something that I rarely get to experience. I'm just not good at clicking on those heads. I'll either miss all of my shots or die after only landing 1 or 2. And if I'm someone who struggles to get the most out of this weapon, then I'm certain that I'm not the only one. And I think that speaks to the larger balancing act going on with the Bazaar Bargain. The reason you don't see every sniper or even cheater running it is because it does require a bit of investment and the ability to consistently perform well to get the most out of it. One errant mistake can cause your 7-head streak you've carefully built up to be lost instantly, and the skill floor requirement of being able to land multiple headshots in a single life that not every player will be able to acclimate to. Compared to the consistent safety of stock, the more forgiving bonuses of the Heatmaker, and the insane damage of the Machina, the Bazaar Bargain simply has a higher skill floor and a smaller margin of error to gain its primary bonuses. The Bazaar Bargain is probably the most transparent example of a weapon that's inaccessible to lesser skilled or new players in this video. Even more so than the direct hit kunai or widowmaker, it's a weapon that rewards getting kills with more kills, yet punishes the inability to reliably contribute to a fight with a negative that makes it a direct downgrade from stock without a bit of investment. If you're not landing 3 or more headshots per life, then you're wasting time using the Bazaar Bargain. But if you're clicking on those heads and securing those picks, then there's very little that can stop you. So where does that leave us? Well, I think I've developed a clearer understanding of the design mentality behind these weapons. They're often beginner traps, either tantalizing the player with really cool appealing upsides and designs, and then swiftly punishing them for not being able to use them well, or presenting seemingly innocuous upsides that new players won't immediately see the value in. These are weapons that require knowledge of the game and an understanding of both what makes them so strong and how to use them to get the most out of. Not every weapon has to be beginner friendly, and it's okay for something to require adaptation and practice from the player. These are weapons that, in the hands of a new player, may seem bad, but once everything clicks, you enter that flow state and you start securing kills, you'll never want to put them down. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was really fun to make and really got me to use some weapons I don't generally tend to go for, so I hope you enjoyed. Have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Thanks and cheers. Critical hits are definitely a mechanic in TF2, and that's all I can say because I really don't want to be killed in the street today. Not for real though, critical hits are contentious in TF2 for a reason. Randomly dealing 3 times extra damage in an otherwise very skill and execution based game is definitely a bit funny sometimes, but also borderline frustrating when you're on the receiving end of it. That said, you really only hear people complaining about random critical hits in TF2, and the game has plenty of other ways to deal them. A lot of these are perfectly liked and respected, like you don't often hear people complaining about things like the Kritzkrieg or even Pyro's Puff and Sting combos. That said, what about weapons that store guaranteed crits? Weapons that, with optimal play, can theoretically grant the player a near infinite supply of 3 times damage attacks so long as they can stay alive to use whenever they want. There are exactly 3 of these weapons in the game, and they range in reception from being perfectly well liked to somewhere in the middle to downright hated. In this video, I want to talk about TF2's crit storing weapons. Weapons that allow the player to store guaranteed critical hits that they can use whenever they want, yet are lost on death. Are these weapons fair? Are they broken? Are they underpowered? We're gonna try and figure that out today. With that said, let's roll. Let's start off with probably the least notable of the 3 crit storing weapons in the game, being the Man Melter. I'm sure that when I said there were 3 weapons in the game like this, some of you had to run a check in your heads to figure out which one I could have been referring to, and yeah, the Man Melter isn't exactly a terribly memorable weapon. It's a Weta Workshop ray gun after all, which are famously one of TF2's less prestigious item categories. However, I have had some Man Melter truthers come out of the woodwork on my previous videos and tell me that it's actually really good, with one guy even going so far as to say that it's Pyro's best in slot secondary. That got me curious to earnestly try it out. The Man Melter is a secondary flare gun replacement for Pyro that fires a fast-moving arced projectile that deals 30 damage on hit and briefly ignites enemies with afterburn. The projectile itself moves 50% faster than Pyro's other flare guns, and with afterburn considered, this weapon can do a default maximum of 90 damage. On top of that, it doesn't require ammo and can be fired as many times as you want, with the only condition being a brief buffer period between shots that's signaled by the gun clicking and setting out a bit of sparks. All of this combined makes spamming Man Melter shots into crowds of enemies or choke points a totally effective strategy and something that's worth considering in the thick of things. However, the Man Melter's main positive is its ability to slurp the fire off of ignited teammates, extinguishing them, healing the Pyro for 20 health, and granting you a stored crit all at once. This is hypothetically pretty redundant, as Pyro already has an air blast that does the first 2 things on command, has secondaries that can guarantee critical hits whenever you want on burning targets, and it requires the enemy team to have an actively contributing Pyro to get the most out of it. It sounds like a pretty mediocre weapon, however, I'd say the situations this weapon shines in line up a bit more often than you'd expect. For starters, the Pyro has flamethrowers that actively discourage air blasting. Between the degreaser and backburner's increased ammo cost and the phlogistinator's complete lack of an ability to do so, the Man Melter by design combos exceptionally well with weapons like these. As for needing enemy Pyros, trust me when I say that there's no shortage of them in casual, and as for this weapon's overlap with the flare gun, I'd say they thrive in completely different circumstances. The flare gun is obviously a potent kill confirming and combo tool, with the player being capable of burning an enemy, air blasting, switching to the flare gun, and landing a 90 damage crit to confirm the kill. This is powerful, but relies on you being capable of getting close to the enemies and trapping them after already having lit them on fire. After the degreaser's numerous nerfs, this has become significantly less consistent. It's still definitely powerful, but not mandatory anymore. By comparison, I'd say that the Man Melter is a very potent poking and surprise tool. Anyone who's ever played Overwatch should be familiar with the concept of poking, where you peck at distant enemies with true damage projectiles to whittle down their defenses before they can get close. The Man Melter is very good at this, as its fast projectile, infinite ammo, lack of damage fall off, and overall spammability make it a premier option for whittling enemies down from a distance. When you combine this with guaranteed stored crits which deal 90 damage plus 60 in afterburn that, let me remind you, last as long as you can live and until you use them, can really facilitate a powerful, surprise damaging pyro playstyle. If you combine this weapon with either the Phlog or especially the backburner, you're skirting around most of those weapons' biggest downsides in pretty comfortable fashion. It's honestly really fun, and it feels really good to be able to instantly remove fire from the enemy while also healing yourself a bit and granting guaranteed extra damage. It adds a bit of an extra benefit to what's already one of Pyro's most important and class-defining features, and overall makes for a really dynamic and fun play experience that genuinely feels different from the flare gun. That's not to say that it's perfect though, as the Man Melter definitely does have some issues. On a technical side, the radius to be able to suck the fire off of teammates feels pretty inconsistent. It might be ping dependent for all I know, oftentimes requiring you to be rubbing hitboxes with the target, and the huge fire effect that shows up when you shoot a crit is really distracting and blocks a ton of your vision. It can make it hard to adjust your aim in the last few frames before your attack actually goes out. On a more meta level, this gun obviously competes with the Scorch Shot and Detonator, which are two flare guns. Its use cases are much more specialized than the Man Melter, and it struggles a bit from Pyro's base mechanics as a class. The other two weapons in this video require a more distant passive participation in fights from the player, whereas the Man Melter encourages the Pyro to be right in the thick of things to gain its primary benefits. It's very easy to die, and when you lose those crits on death, it's not a great combo. But all things considered, I walked away from this project with a pretty positive view on the Man Melter. It's an easy weapon to forget, but when you remember it, it's a pretty fun and unique tool within Pyro's lineup. I wouldn't say that it's their best in slot secondary or even my second or third choice, but it's one that I can definitely see the merits in after using it for this video. If you've never really tried the Man Melter out, give it a whirl after finishing this video. It's not amazing, but it's not bad by any stretch either. That said, on to our next subject.
Being dead just got me mad.
Whereas the Man Melter was a fun if mid-tier weapon, our next entry is a fun if very high-tier weapon. It's also probably the most well-liked in this video, the Frontier Justice. I don't know about you guys, but I've literally never seen someone complain about this weapon or claim that it's overpowered or broken, outside of general complaints regarding the mini-sentry battle engineer playstyle. And even then, if you struggle to kill a battle engineer enough that you feel that they're overpowered, that probably says more about you than it does about the balance of the game. Regardless, the Frontier Justice is a sublime weapon. While it's not as meta or class-defining as something like the Rescue Ranger, or as unique as something like the Widowmaker, it's still a strong tool that can really flourish in the right hands. It requires a bit of passive setup and actively doing your job as engineer for a bit to get the most out of it, and is all around a really fun weapon. But what makes it so fun? What makes the Frontier Justice tick as a tool for engineer? Well, let's dive into it and find out. The Frontier Justice is an unlockable shotgun for engineer that fires at the same rate as stock, deals the same amount of damage, and fires the same amount of pellets per shot. That sounded pretty familiar. However, it only loads half as many shots per clip, storing a maximum of only 3 shots at a time before needing to reload. This alone makes it a direct downgrade from stock when using it for general frontline battle engineer fighting, as you're effectively only dealing 50% of your maximum damage before needing to reload. However, the Frontier Justice is balanced out by one very specific yet very powerful positive stat, gaining revenge crits when your sentry is destroyed. Revenge crits are stored whenever your sentry does its job, with 1 being rewarded for an assist and 2 being rewarded for a kill. Once your sentry is destroyed, so long as you as the engineer are alive and have the Frontier Justice equipped, you will be given a supply of guaranteed stored crits to use whenever you want based on how many kills your sentry got. This caps out at 35 crits, or just over 17 kills with your sentry, and the crits are both lost on death and not earned at all if the engineer is dead when his sentry goes down. This alone gives the Frontier Justice a ton of inherent push and pull between the engineer and his enemies. The engineer can hang by his sentry and turtle to his heart's content, but in order to use his revenge crits, he'll need to survive his sentry's destruction. For the enemy, it might be a bit of a red flag where the engineer is demonstrably alive yet isn't protecting his sentry gun. This adds a bit of an intrinsic skill-based back and forth between the Frontier Justice engineer and his opponents. Destroying the sentry is a choice on both ends that yields positives and negatives for both teams. Once the sentry goes down and the engineer is rocking his revenge crits, he's suddenly roaming the map with a potentially unlimited supply of 180 damage shots that he can use at his own discretion. When the engineer is using the Frontier Justice, he always has a backup plan in tow, and his sentry is hardly the last of the enemy team's concerns. Couple this with the fact that he can potentially rebuild while still maintaining his revenge crits to snowball even more, and you've got a recipe for a frighteningly strong Texan. Helping this is the fact that the Frontier Justice is a shotgun. That means that, unlike the other two weapons in this video, it fires multiple crit pellets with each shot within a frontal cone, and thus does not require pinpoint perfect aim to get the most out of. If you hit the enemy with even a few of your revenge crit pellets, they're taking a significant chunk of damage, and that gives this weapon a degree of leniency that the other two crit storing weapons do not have. There is a bit of wiggle room in terms of how accurate you have to be in order to get the most out of it. However, even with all of these positives, the Frontier Justice is still not a perfect weapon, and there is still plenty of counterplay to it. For one, despite the NG rocking some big damage, he still only got a maximum of 150 health with the gunslinger, and no mobility once his sentry goes down, and is still very easy to out-DM and take down, even with his revenge crits. Once he's gone, his crits all go with him. It's very easy to interrupt a Frontier Justice NG's potential game-winning snowball. On top of that, if you can capitalize and either kill the engineer at the same time as his sentry, or kill a sentry while he's already dead, then he doesn't get the crits at all. All of those kills the sentry got effectively go to waste. The Frontier Justice is very strong when it works, but it requires multiple positive conditions to line up in the engineer's favor for him to get the most out of it. It does have a significant amount of very easy counterplay. On top of that, the 3 less bullets per clip thing is pretty huge. If an engineer has this thing equipped for an entire round as a precaution in case his sentry goes down, then he's effectively rocking a stock shotgun with 50 less potential damage per clip. If you notice that he has it and the gun isn't glowing, then you can usually afford to be pretty aggressive. The engineer packs, if I may, a little less gun when he doesn't have revenge crits using this weapon. But honestly, I really like that about the Frontier Justice. This was actually the first crit storing weapon that Valve ever added to the game, and I think they knocked it out of the park on their first try. It has an incredibly powerful, tantalizing upside, yet one that comes with multiple inherent risks and loads of intrinsic counterplay. This really is a very intelligently designed weapon, and one that I think that people kind of sleep on. Not in a use amount way, you see plenty of engineers running this thing, but more in an admiring its design sort of way. It's cool. I like the Frontier Justice. But what would happen if we inverted everything I just said and made a very poorly designed crit storing weapon? One that took all of the counterplay and positives of the Frontier Justice and flipped them on their heads. What happens then? Well, let's find out.
All in a day's work.
Okay, so just take everything I just said about the Frontier Justice, but make it annoying instead. I know you guys watch my skill check weapons video and were outraged by me claiming that the conniver's kunai required thought and opportunistic precision to use well, so you'll be elated to know that I am firmly in the diamondback is a bit silly camp of thought. This is one of the most contentious and widely hated weapons in TF2, with many players decrying its goofy-ah design and even some professional spy mains actively refusing to use it. I'm personally not as down on this weapon as others. I certainly think it's poorly designed, but I haven't been killed by it enough or capitalized on its snowball potential enough to really feel strongly about it either way. That said, most people really hate this thing. But why is that? What makes the diamondback such a controversial weapon? Let's discuss it. The Diamondback is an unlockable revolver for spy with a sleek futuristic design. It boasts a flat 15% damage penalty as its primary negative, putting its damage on par with the Ambassador without the firing speed penalty. However, you know how the Ambassador was infamously nerfed into the ground in Jungle Inferno and requires a fair amount of in-the-moment precision at a very specific range to get the most out of? The Diamondback just kind of laughs at that. The Diamondback's primary positive is that it stores guaranteed critical hits for every sapped building and every backstab that the spy earns, capping again at 35 and dealing a per crit damage of 102. One thing that we haven't discussed about critical hits up to this point in the video, as it hasn't really been relevant to the previous two weapons, is that they mitigate damage fall off, always dealing their maximum no matter how far away the enemy is from the attacker, with some exceptions. This means that a spy with a diamondback crit can fire off what are effectively 102 damage hit-scanned sniper rounds from any range so long as he's able to set up a bit first. And that right there is the main problem with the diamondback. Despite the fact that it does have a 15% damage penalty compared to stock, it rewards the spy incredibly handsomely for performing his base function as a class, giving the spy guaranteed stored crits for sapping buildings and especially earning backstabs would be like giving the scout guaranteed stored crits for double jumping or demo man guaranteed stored crits for destroying buildings. It's giving players an incredibly powerful boost for doing something that is basic and integral to the role of their class. Rewarding players for doing their job well is fine, but there is such a thing as being too generous and rewarding the wrong things. And unlike the Man Melter, which requires switching off of a powerful combo and mobility tool, or the Frontier Justice, which has a ton of risk and counterplay, the Diamondback doesn't really have too many downsides outside of that 15% damage penalty. Unlike the Ambassador, which also has a slower firing speed and has its crits affected by damage fall off on top of its damage penalty, a spy with the Diamondback performing his job well is effectively always sitting on guaranteed 102 damage shots from any range. The spy doesn't have enough strong best-in-slot picks to make equipping the Diamondback anything but a no-brainer to a player intending to use their gun at any point. Maybe the Latrange? I don't know. 15% less damage isn't a huge downside if you're almost always going to be hitting for 102 when you're playing well. And I know what you might be thinking. Well, Spy is a frail class who's easy to kill, and he loses his crits upon death. Isn't that a risk? Well, yeah, but the Spy also has more ways to skirt guaranteed death than Engineer or Pyro, and his means of gaining more crits after a death requires less investment. You can easily equip the Dead Ringer or Spycicle alongside this thing, or if you're extra daring, bring the kunai and get a guaranteed 210 health overheal alongside that free crit. If a Spy is playing in a stealthy manner and only taking attacks of opportunity, it can be very difficult to snuff him out before he can get a crazy snowball roll going. A spy can easily earn and maintain a good amount of diamondback crits while also playing much more picky-choosy with his fights than Engineer or Pyro. And while a Pyro has to be on the front lines, extinguishing teammates and doing their best to mitigate any damage they're taking while doing that, and an Engineer has to build a sentry and get kills or assists on it, which can be difficult depending on the map and game state, a spy just has to sneak behind and sap a teleporter, or backstab an AFK heavy. Also, fun fact, crits do not show up on the spy's disguises, so you can very easily be mollywop for 102 damage from someone you thought was your teammate due to having no means of knowing that the spy they could potentially be has diamondback crits. Kind of makes the Enforcer's whole 20% extra damage while disguised thing seem a bit pedestrian, huh? And what's really messed up is that even if the spy can't kill you with his allocated crits, he's still taking a significant chunk of health with even one, and against anyone who's not a heavy, is putting every class within 1 or 2 shot range even without a crit after landing a single one. And even in the worst case scenario for the spy, where he beefs nearly all of his crits and dies, landing a single one still puts a class at a significant disadvantage to any other enemies around them, and the spy can do this from any range. Personally, not a huge fan of the Diamondback. I don't think it's necessarily broken or even over-centralizing, but it's definitely the least well thought out of the 3 crit storing weapons in the game. I've heard people propose a lot of ways to fix it, such as granting mini crits instead of full crits, reverting it to its pre-2013 state of only granting crits on saps, debuffing the spy while it's active and things like that, but I honestly think it could do with a full rework. Make it a bit more risky and more in line with something like the Ambassador, because right now, it's just a wee bit goofy. I'm sorry this video turned into a stealth assassination mission against the Diamondback. I promise I don't hate you or anything if you use it. This is ultimately still just a gun in a 16-year-old game, but I do think it's important to have perspective on things like this. Maybe there is a reason that the Diamondback is so controversial. I don't know. So where does that leave us? Well, I think we learned a lot about what makes a good and bad design for a crit storing weapon in this video. The Frontier Justice is obviously a great design. It rewards the Engineer handsomely for doing his job, but has a lot of inherent risks involved in gaining its primary benefit, and even when you do, you can be snuffed out easily. The Man Melter is a more middling design, definitely being fun, but competing and overlapping a lot with a lot of arguably much better in-slot options. And the Diamondback is just a silly little guy. Giving the player access to weapons that can store up to 35 guaranteed triple damage attacks is hypothetically very problematic, and I kind of love that TF2 has examples that cover every base of why an idea like this would or wouldn't work in terms of balance. We've got strong advocates for it, strong advocates against it, and an advocate that's just happy to be here. Regardless, thanks for watching. I'm sorry if I offended you by making fun of the Diamondback. Go watch my skill-dependent weapons video if you want me to say some positive things about a controversial spy weapon. Regardless, thanks for watching. Hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers. Team Fortress 2 can be a daunting game for a new player to learn. Between the 16 plus years of history, the 9 playable classes, each with unique roles, metas, and tech, the over 100 unlockable weapons, and the infinite amount of community in-jokes and lingo, it's easy to say that TF2 isn't the most beginner-friendly game in its current state. However, there do exist some means for new players to more gently ease themselves into the game. A few weapons and playstyles that tend to coddle new players more than others, and give them a more lenient, forgiving learning experience compared to some of the game's other options. These weapons tend to have a few things in common. They tend to have large amounts of upsides, or a single powerful upside, contrasted against some seemingly innocuous yet truly crushing downsides, and they tend to be easier to use than stock, but less effective overall. I find these weapons to be very fascinating, as in the hands of a new or inexperienced player, they could easily seem like must-equips that make you wonder, why are we not running these? Yet in the hands of a more experienced player, the cracks will become much more visible. In this video, I want to talk about 5 of these beginner's trap weapons in TF2. Weapons that tantalize new players with a long list of appealing upsides, yet ultimately teach them fundamentally bad lessons in the long term about the game. If you use these weapons, that's totally fine, and I promise I'm not making fun of you. I like a few of them myself, and just wanted to talk about some weapons in a YouTube video. You'll find that these weapon subcategory videos are actually just mini weapon reviews with a vague unified theme. That said, let's roll.
Only pay for what you need.
Liberty, 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 liberty.
The Liberty Launcher is the first weapon we're discussing in this video, not only because Soldier is the first class who has a weapon in this video in the conventional class order, but also because it's the one I feel epitomizes one of the main design philosophies for this video the most. And what is that design philosophy? Well, it's that these weapons tend to be training wheels. Not in the way that the rocket jumper or sticky jumper are, but more in the way that makes them easier to use, yet all around weaker than stock or other options. They pad a lot of their respective classes' weaknesses or difficulties, yet sacrifice very important aspects of those classes to do it. But what makes the Liberty Launcher a training wheel weapon? Let's talk about it. The Liberty Launcher is an unlockable rocket launcher for Soldier with 3 very appealing upsides. Its rockets travel faster than stock, somewhere between stock and the direct hit, its rockets deal less damage to the Soldier while rocket jumping, and most importantly, it stores 1 extra rocket in its clip. These upsides are, to put it lightly, extremely strong, and can easily make this seem like a no-brainer must-equip type of weapon. The combination of 1 extra rocket and less damaging rocket jumps on top of a faster projectile with standard blast radius can facilitate a very fun, very mobile, and very active Soldier playstyle. It can be very fun to jump around, hammer enemies with attacks that are too fast and numerous for them to counter, and just overall be a menace on any given map. However, all of these pluses are balanced out by one simple, incredibly punishing downside that makes this less of a no-brainer than you'd probably expect: a 25% damage penalty. Now, this might not seem like a big deal. After all, TF2 has other weapons with damage penalties that are still very strong, and has weapons with damage bonuses that are considered quite bad. Raw damage values are not everything in TF2. And yeah, with the Liberty Launcher, you'll probably find yourself having a bit of fun at first, pelting enemies with attacks, diving important targets, all in all being a very mobile force, but then you'll start noticing some problems. Like, hey, why wasn't I able to secure the kill on that medic? Why did it take 4 close-range rockets to destroy that disabled sentry? Why am I not able to outdamage a tanked sentry during an uber charge? And that's the primary problem with the Liberty Launcher. Soldier, at a fundamental level, is a class who specializes in frontline fighting and killing important enemy playmakers. Being able to kill medics in 2 rockets, damage sentries faster than they can be healed, dive snipers, put out damage in team fights, things like that are integral to Soldier's base role as a class. The Liberty Launcher makes everything that Soldier does easier, but also simultaneously strips away his most important defining trait to do so. The Liberty Launcher is interesting in this regard because it poises to make every aspect of Soldier's game plan easier and more consistent, allowing for a more lenient and forgiving experience playing him, yet sacrifices what makes Soldier such a useful class to do so. Because of this, it can potentially be a very damaging weapon for a new player to stumble across. If they get used to the extra rocket, the faster projectile, and the more forgiving jumps, it can be hard to switch back. And the fact of the matter is that, despite it making Soldier easier to play, you're consistently outputting less damage and thus helping helping your team less, making this all around a somewhat selfish rocket launcher. But okay, the Liberty Launcher obviously has its fans, and it's not often in the discussion for worst weapon in the game, so it'd be hyperbolic of me to pretend that it's an objectively bad weapon. I'll admit that I had a lot of fun using the Liberty Launcher at first, and even found myself starting to slip down the stock to Liberty pipeline, but as I played with it, I noticed more and more that I was losing fights, not taking out sentries, letting enemies get away, and just not securing kills that I otherwise would have. And then I realized that I was trying to play stock soldier and not Liberty Launcher soldier. A stock soldier is a powerful, team-anchoring force who can handily solo an entire group of enemies with precision and a little luck. The combination of mobility, spread damage, and sheer damage numbers make him a force to be reckoned with under the right circumstances. A Liberty Launcher soldier, by comparison, lacks those big damage numbers, and may find themselves failing to secure what would have otherwise been sure-win scenarios with stock. Because of this, the Liberty Launcher flourishes as an off-soldier weapon, or as a supplementary weapon for a second or third soldier on a team. It's significantly weaker than stock on its own, and its extra traits aren't really going to help push your team to victory any more than another rocket launcher would. It relies on having another soldier to help anchor your team. And that's ultimately my biggest problem with the Liberty Launcher. Its bonuses are plentiful, yet it ends up strong-arming Soldier into a very specific playstyle that is not his primary role. If you're the only soldier on your team and you're running the Liberty Launcher, then you're depriving your team of extra damage that could be the linchpin in fights just to make your experience more comfortable. It's alluring for sure, but not something you should be falling back on by default at every moment. A weapon for Spy or Engineer that does less damage in exchange for utility is fine because those classes are not frontline gunfighters, but in Soldier's case, his main team utility is outputting damage and securing important kills. And while the Liberty Launcher definitely can do this, it's ultimately worse at it than stock outside of a very specific off-soldier playstyle. Also, because I know some smartass is gonna bring this up, I know Soldier has the banners for team support as well. Damage is not explicitly his only utility, but guess what? You need to do damage to build up the banners, and guess what the Liberty Launcher does less of? All things considered, the Liberty Launcher is an alluring weapon that, like a shady back alley dealer, promises to make all your struggles easier, yet hides the slippery slope of dependency you'll be going down once you start using it. It's padding or cushioning for the soldier's more difficult aspects as a class that, yes, does help, but also cushions your enemies. And as Soldier, cushioning should be the last thing you're concerned about. It's a fun, mobile weapon, yet one that can lead you down a dangerous path if you become dependent on its extra bells and whistles.
You're too slow! Come on, step it up!
We're finally talking about heavy on this channel. It's good to be talking about my personal favorite class in the game. However, it's also kind of a bittersweet feeling as we're discussing what's probably my least favorite primary available to him in the game, the Brass Beast. The reason we're skipping the conventional class order and moving on to heavy next is because I feel like this weapon personifies a second type of design mentality for this video. New player bait weapons, or weapons that have such appealing positive stats that someone could easily neglect their likely crushing downsides in favor of taking advantage of those stats. Quick aside though, in MBM specifically, I can't deny that this weapon is great. Heavy doesn't need to move much in MBM, especially on Manhattan, so becoming a player-controlled turret that just vomits out insane damage numbers is totally viable and something that I can't take away from it. Against other conscious, living human players though, I find the Brass Beast to be pretty underwhelming despite its insane numbers. But why is that? The Brass Beast is an unlockable minigun for heavy with two very appealing positive stats. It boasts a 20% damage bonus over stock, and grants the heavy a 20% damage resistance bonus when below half health and spun up. The first stat is understandably very tantalizing, as heavy is already the highest player-controlled sustained damage source in the game, and boosting his damage numbers even further can allow him to easily shred what would have otherwise been very close or tricky battles. Just standing there and vomiting out insane damage is really fun. The damage resistance below half health is also a sleeper underrated stat, as it allows heavy to tough out fights he would have otherwise crumpled under and leverage his boosted damage for even longer, especially against other heavies. These two stats are understandably very appealing. Extra damage is generally a good thing, and the damage resistance along with it really articulates that this is meant to be a big numbers type of minigun. Leverage heavy's already sky-high damage and tankiness with even more damage and tankiness. However, in the previous section, you may have remembered me alluding to a weapon with increased damage that's considered to be quite bad in spite of it, and that, my astute observational viewers, was referencing the Brass Beast. Because despite this weapon's sky-high damage output, Its downsides make it a remarkably unfun weapon for me to use in casual PvP gameplay, from my experience anyways. The Brass Beast's two downsides act in unison to make it an all-around mediocre weapon that's profoundly anti-fun to use. It boasts a 50% slower spin-up time compared to Heavy's other miniguns, taking a whopping 1.5 seconds to fully spin up, and makes Heavy 60% slower than stock while spun up. This makes him easily the slowest mobile force in the game, moving even slower than an MBM tank with a standard speed of 15%. For reference, a Heavy with any other minigun spun up moves more than twice as fast as this, and a Heavy while not spun up moves up to 5 times as quickly. Now, this might not seem that bad. I've heard some people argue that since Heavy is already slow, you're not sacrificing too much by moving slower to output more damage. However, I view this as kind of a bad faith observation that fundamentally misunderstands Heavy as a class. Because yes, Heavy is definitely slow, the slowest class in the game, but mistaking him for completely immobile can be a costly mistake. In fact, I've personally found that being able to walk forward while revved up is one of Heavy's strongest traits. When you're playing as Heavy, especially with the backing support of your team, being able to quite literally throw your weight around and leverage your massive health pool and damage to push into the enemy while holding down M1 can be a frightening thing for that enemy to deal with. With proper positioning and good aim, you can basically become a living do not pass wall of damage, preventing everything in your path from pushing past you. You are the purest definition of a team anchor in the game, and being able to leverage your class's positive traits to gain ground on the enemy is one of your strongest abilities. A buffed Heavy with his team behind him pushing into your team can be a difficult thing to surmount without a dedicated hard counter, and it's all around one of my favorite things about Heavy as a class. For reference, which of these two clips do you think looks more fun?
How are they not finding an engineer just walking around aimlessly suspicious?
The Brass Beast, for all intents and purposes, basically turns Heavy into what people who don't play him think he is. A slow, lumbering, predictable, bait-and-punish oriented damage hose that takes no positioning or brain to play well. You're basically required to hunker down and wait for enemies with this weapon, rather than taking a proactive role in battle. The Brass Beast does insane damage, yes, but it strong-arms you into playing an almost entirely defensive and passive playstyle. Trying to be aggressive or forward with the Brass Beast is an exercise in futility. Your slow spin-up time and slow move speed make you about as difficult as an MBM tank to deal with to skilled players. The Brass Beast mandates extremely careful, conservative Heavy play. You have to be very predictive, picky, and choosy with when and where you rev up, as the ability of stock or the Tomislav to jump rev for each individual encounter really isn't an option. A full 1.5 seconds of rev time is a lot in the throes of a TF2 match, and is more than enough for most classes to deal irreparable damage to you before you can even begin fighting back. But, to be totally fair, once you get into groove with the Brass Beast, it can be kind of fun. Once you've gotten adjusted to revving preemptively rather than reactively, and start positioning yourself where fights will be rather than where they are, you can start spitting out some real damage. My core problem with the item, however, is that you're compromising so much of Heavy's flexibility and game plan for what effectively boils down to larger numbers. And those numbers don't even really mean much. Heavy is a sustained damage class, so he's not really concerned about crossing per shot damage thresholds. You're already dealing the highest player-controlled sustain in the game, so do you really need to strap weights to your shoes to deal even more? It just kind of strikes me as excessive and unnecessary. How many fights are you really winning because of that 20% extra damage? Would you have won anyways with the extra second of shooting you would have had with stock that you wouldn't have spent revving up? Important questions to think about. All in all, the Brass Beast is a weapon that I can see the appeal of. Turn a tanky, high-damaging class into an even tankier, higher-damaginger one. However, in practice, it narrows the Heavy's ability so much and turns him into such an immobile force that I wouldn't be surprised if people who hate playing Heavy have only ever really tried using the Brass Beast. I can understand the appeal, but if you're fiercely married to this as your primary Heavy weapon, I strongly encourage you to try out another option and see how much more flexible Heavy can be. He's big, slow, and fat, but he doesn't have to be to this extent. Again, it's not terrible, but it's certainly situational, and is a weapon that mandates you play it rather than playing your class. We have one more category to break down in this video, that being the bad learning tool weapon. This is a type of weapon that may be totally effective or strong in the right hands, yet also teaches new players fundamentally bad lessons about their class. They may encourage you to overuse certain class traits, underuse others, and everything in between. And no weapon strikes me as being as much of a bad learning tool as the phlogistinator. The phlogistinator, or phlog, is an infamous weapon within TF2, with its combination of power against inexperienced or uncoordinated players, presumed brain-dead ease of use, and habit of encouraging players not to use one of Pyro's fundamental abilities, making it controversial at best and downright hated at worst. Depending on who you ask, you'll receive any numbers of opinions about this weapon, ranging from it being overpowered and broken, to one of the worst weapons in the game, to anywhere in between. Let's try and get to the bottom of this item's tepid reception. The phlogistinator is a flamethrower for Pyro that fires a steady stream of beam-like flames, which behave identically to Pyro's stock flamethrower. Same damage, same afterburn, same everything. As it deals damage, however, it steadily builds a meter known as the oomph meter, which takes a total of 300 damage to fill across any of Pyro's damage-dealing sources. Once it's full, the player can activate a special oomph taunt, granting them brief invulnerability and full crits for around 8 seconds. This makes the phlogistinator's primary use case very clear. It's a high damage oriented flamethrower that allows a smart and careful Pyro to easily steamroll an entire enemy team, running them over with an 8-second stream of guaranteed crits. This ability is compounded by the fact that the oomph can be built by dealing damage with any fire-based weapon, including secondaries, or if you wanted, even the sharpened volcano fragment. On top of this, the taunt can be held for as long as you want, so long as you stay alive, allowing you to save it for optimal use. Here's a clip of me completely ruining an enemy team's game-winning pub push because I pressed G. However, even with as strong and potentially over-centralizing this guaranteed crits for damage mechanic might seem, it's balanced out by the Phlog's primary negative: no air blast. This is deceptively huge, as, make no mistake, the air blast is the thing that keeps Pyro from being the easiest and most linear class in the game. Think about everything air blast does for Pyro. You can extinguish teammates for one, offering team utility and a bit of self-healing. You can disconnect and interrupt Ubers, which is hugely important, as Pyro is one of the only dedicated Uber counters in the game, and you can reflect projectiles, which is both strong, makes it easier to fight soldiers, and enables a ton of advanced tech. Air blast is Pyro's most important tool. So much is mapped to that right mouse button. Taking it away in exchange for a weapon that encourages you to just walk at enemies is a clear recipe for a design that's bound to be controversial. Full disclosure, the Phlog is probably one of my least favorite weapons in TF2. I don't think it's terribly fun to use, as just pushing into enemies holding mouse 1 on Pyro lacks the visceral satisfaction and positioning required to keep the same thing fun to do on Heavy, and the lack of air blast makes you helpless against soldiers attempting to interrupt your push by juggling you. It's a noticeably limited and linear weapon that, yes, can be fun and get results, yet sacrifices so much of Pyro's team utility and tech to accomplish it. However, that's not the main reason I dislike this weapon. The fundamental problem with the Phlog is that it is a terrible learning tool for new Pyros. Because imagine for a second that you're Tony Gonzalez 2009. You've just installed TF2 and you're having a good time. However, you're finding yourself struggling to secure kills, but then you find this fancy futuristic looking ray gun for Pyro through random drop. You equip it and immediately find yourself running over entire teams of hapless free-to-plays. Wow, you might think, this weapon is strong and all I have to do is walk forward. You're securing kills and interrupting pushes, but unbeknownst to you, you're also setting in place bad habits. You're learning that walking forward with the Phlog gets kills. You're learning that you don't need air blast to kill enemy gamers as Pyro. You're learning how to play the class in a fundamentally incorrect and selfish way. And that information is getting instilled in your still learning new player brain. This is, at a core foundational level, a damaging experience for a new player to have. Even if it is strong in the right hands, I have trouble enjoying a weapon that I know is teaching new players the wrong lessons about their class. And I fully realize that this is ultimately just a weapon in a 16-year-old game and that it ain't that deep, but when this game's continued growth and success hinges on new players and their positive experiences, I can't help but find stuff like this a little bit problematic. All in all, the phlogistinator is a perfectly fine weapon in the hands of an experienced player who can understand its strengths and weaknesses, but in the hands of a potential fresh install, it's a damn near crippling weapon that can permanently instill bad habits into their fresh install brain. If you're reliant on the phlog or find yourself neglecting air blast, I'd say to try some other options and see what Pyro can really do with their foot off the gas pedal.
I can't talk right now. I'm making piss.
We've discussed a few different types of weapons in this video so far, so why don't we discuss an item that combines all three of our aforementioned categories into one. This is a weapon that acts as training wheels, has a lot of positive stats contrasted against a small number of very important downsides, and teaches players the wrong lessons about their class. It's also, funnily enough, my favorite weapon to use in this video. We'll talk about that. The Sydney Sleeper. The Sydney Sleeper is an interesting weapon because it's one that completely strips away its class's primary positive trait and role in exchange for a focus on team utility. Team utility that ultimately isn't much stronger than what Sniper is capable of doing with stock, and yet I don't hate it. It's a weapon that tantalizes players with a hefty lineup of positive stats and can definitely be very fun to use, but just kind of performs worse than stock in actual practice. That said, it's also different enough from stock that I don't really feel like any truly negative habits are being instilled into anyone using it. Let's talk about it. The Sydney Sleeper is an unlockable sniper rifle for Sniper with a hefty lineup of positive stats. It charges 25% faster than stock, scoped headshots with it apply Girardi or a 35% damage debuff to enemies for up to 5 seconds, and it can extinguish teammates with fully charged shots, on top of its headshots dealing mini crits, as well as removing 1 second from your Girardi's recharge timer. This is a very sizable lineup of positives, and it clearly sets this weapon's primary use case in stone. It's a support-oriented sniper rifle with a focus on debuffing enemies and securing light class picks with a speed and consistency that stock cannot accomplish. Shooting a faraway enemy and applying 5 seconds of Girardi can be more than enough to help your team secure the kill on that important target, and you can still handily one-shot every light class with 150 or less HP with body shots. The faster charging speed makes this even more consistent, and it can be very fun to delete medics and light classes with a wave of your finger and a flick of your dick. The Sydney Sleeper is primarily balanced out by a very important, somewhat misleading, weapon-defining negative stat. No headshots. That's not entirely true, as it does deal mini crits on headshot rather than a full crit, but it does still mean that even with a mini crit fully charged headshot, you're only dealing a per shot maximum of 203 and cannot one-shot heavies or buffed soldiers under any normal gameplay circumstances. This might not seem that important as you're applying Girardi with each shot and providing team support from a distance. However, it stands to reason that using stock or another sniper rifle and getting a headshot to guarantee an instant kill on any important target is probably more valuable to your team than debuffing that enemy and hoping that they secure the kill on them. The Sydney Sleeper simply lengthens and overcomplicates the process of securing picks as sniper. Even if you can one-shot medics and snipers, arguably the most important picks with a body shot, and can apply Girardi from a distance, you'd arguably be helping your team just as much if not more by headshotting and instantly killing any important targets. Even then, stock can also one-shot medics and weaker classes with body shots, so this weapon is ultimately just kind of redundant. The faster charging speed helps, but you also have a lot of downtime on sniper to charge. It can be very fun to use, but you're all around just adding extra steps to the sniper's job when using it. I've been avoiding using this term up to this point in the video, as I feel it's pretty reductive, but the Sydney Sleeper really does strike me as just kind of a crutch. It removes the pressure and obligation of getting headshots in exchange for an ideological bonus that's, all things considered, slower and less consistent than what you're capable of with stock. Sure, you don't have to worry about landing headshots and can still help your team out with body shots, but I have trouble internalizing this as anything other than compensation for players who aren't consistently able to land headshots but still want to play snipers. And you know what? Even with all of that said, and all of the points I've made up to this point in the video, I still kind of like the Sydney Sleeper.
It's me. Hi, I'm the problem, it's me.
As I've said, this is probably my favorite weapon in this video to actually use. Part of this is because I myself suck at landing headshots and usually default to fully charged body shots anyways, but also just because it's kind of like fun to use. Like, landing a fully charged body shot and dropping enemies with that splash of Girardi and unique sound effect is uniquely satisfying as far as sniper goes, and it can be really enticing to watch enemies scramble as they lose half or more of their HP and get Girardi'd at the same time. Plus, this weapon looks, sounds, and feels different to use in the stock sniper rifle, so unlike something like the Phlog, I feel like most new players will likely realize that this is a side grade and not a guaranteed get out of jail free card for playing the class. I fully acknowledge and realize this weapon's shortcomings. It's effectively padding for people who can't land headshots, but I still kind of like using it every now and then. You can be a real menace to the enemy team with this thing in a way that's entirely unique from stock. However, even my opinion here speaks to a larger issue with the Sydney Sleeper. If I use this item partially because it aligns with my lack of an ability to land headshots, then surely I'm not the only one. This is a weapon that, like the Liberty Launcher from earlier, provides cushioning and padding to one or more specific skill-intensive aspects of the class it's featured on. How could you call a weapon that makes the class easier to play in exchange for less power or consistent reliability anything other than a set of literal training wheels? The Sydney Sleeper is, all around, a weapon that epitomizes several design elements we've discussed in this video. It acts as cushioning for players who want to play sniper yet find themselves unable to land headshots. It teaches players not to prioritize headshots, thus ignoring their class's primary job, and boast an impressive lineup of positive stats contrasted against a seemingly innocuous single downside. All in all, this thing should be my least favorite weapon in the game. And yet, unlike the Phlog or the Brass Beast, it boasts a combination of being fun enough to use and different enough from stock to be a uniquely fun experience every now and then. I don't feel like I'm giving anything up, but I all around enjoy this weapon more than some other stuff on this list. I wouldn't recommend using it over stock for most experienced players, but for me, it's my kind of thing.
Here it is, Patrick. The ultimate prank. Invisible spray!
And as our final entry on this list, let's have a bit of a bonus. Every other weapon in this video has been a primary that does damage, but for our final entry, let's discuss a utility weapon, the Cloak and Dagger. This is a weapon that I can personally attest to regarding its nature as a beginner's trap, as I remember thinking this thing was all the rage when I first started playing TF2 over a decade ago. However, as an adult player with more experience, I see this weapon for what it is, a niche if fun side grade rather than a direct upgrade. The Cloak and Dagger is an unlockable cloaking watch for Spy with the following stats. Its cloak regens 100% faster than the stock Invis watch, yet it can't gather cloak from ammo boxes, and it gains 35% less cloak from ammo boxes. Its primary trait, though, is that its cloak reduces based on the Spy's movement, with it draining significantly quicker than stock while running, draining at a slower rate while crouch walking, and starting to refill while completely standing still. This potentially allows a Spy to stay cloaked indefinitely, so long as they're periodically stopping to let their cloak refill. So, this might sound like a perfect weapon. I certainly thought it was as a kid. Infinite cloak so long as I stand still? What's not to like? And yeah, if you want to turn TF2 into a nature documentary where you observe the battle around you, or slowly crouch walk through a battlefield, then it definitely is. However, in practice, the Cloak and Dagger is a weapon that requires a good degree of finesse and a lot of patience to use correctly, which has effectively earned it the nickname amongst the community of the Cloak and Do Nothing. The watch drains its cloak significantly faster than stock while running, so you have to move slow with it. If you attempt to use the Cloak and Dagger like the stock Invis watch, you'll quickly find yourself running out of cloak and sticking out like a sore thumb. Conversely, if you attempt to use it hyper passively and never let your cloak drain, then you'll find yourself never contributing to fights. I found the Cloak and Dagger to be most effective in staking out potential targets and finding tricky, sneaky places to hold while you await the perfect opportunity to strike. Propping yourself up while invisible behind an enemy, patiently waiting for an opportunity, slinking in, securing a pick, and then swiftly escaping while recloaking makes you feel the most like a genuine assassin out of any of Spy's watches. On top of that, it can be surprisingly effective as an escape tool, as the time-honored tradition of hiding somewhere, crouching, and holding still can be pretty good. Most players are inclined to continue chasing the Spy in the direction they last saw them running, rather than checking the area around where they last saw the Spy, so standing still can be a shockingly effective strategy. However, all of this is balanced out by the Cloak and Dagger simply requiring more positioning and execution to use effectively than stock. For a weapon that has a reputation of being brain dead and encouraging players to hide in place for hours on end, finding the right places to position yourself, knowing when and where the best times to hold still or push are, not getting caught by stray fire as you slowly try and sneak in, finding the perfect moments to attack and escape, all of these skills are integral to using the Cloak and Dagger well. As an achievement item, this could very well be one of the first weapons that a new spy player unlocks, and despite its reputation, it is not an easy weapon to use efficiently. It requires a careful mix of finesse and patience. You have to find the right balance between moving enough that you can still do your job, and being patient enough to take advantage of the watch's unique traits. All of this combined makes the Cloak and Dagger an appealing watch, but one that's neither beginner-friendly nor a must-use in every situation. A new player stumbling across this weapon can easily find themselves becoming dependent on it, and considering how careful of a balancing act you have to pull to do it right, combined with it not being applicable to every map and game state, that can be a tricky situation to enter. My number one piece of advice is not to approach the Cloak and Dagger like the stock Invis watch, and not to get too comfortable just hiding from enemies for entire matches. It requires a different, more considerate type of spy play to use well. It can be rewarding, but it can also be a detriment to you and your team if used improperly. Keep that in mind. So, what's my final verdict on some of these beginner's trap weapons in TF2? Well, they tend to be easier, more comfortable, and more forgiving to use than stock, or otherwise offer some kind of tantalizing bonus, yet all around perform worse and generally just provide padding to what are usually easily overcome aspects of learning a class. They poise to offer players shortcuts to learning a class or make the process of learning them easier, yet all that they really do is provide training wheels and teach fundamentally bad long-term lessons. All in all, these are some of the most interestingly designed weapons in the game to me. In the hands of an experienced player, they can be fun side grades or diversions, but to a new, inexperienced, or less skilled player, they can tend to form bad habits and potentially teach players very bad lessons. If you love or main these weapons, then more power to you. I just feel as though, for me personally, there's usually better options, or at the very least, options that sacrifice less to allow more. Still, even with all of this said, lest we not forget that I did get kicked from a match for going on a kill streak with the Brass Beast while recording for this video, and that's ultimately what matters, that people think you're cheating because you're using a weapon too well. Thanks for watching, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! Most TF2 weapons tend to be pretty cut and dry in terms of their intentions and designs. You equip them, immediately start using them, and can instantly reap the rewards of using an unlockable weapon. In the cases that they're not, it's usually for some kind of snowball mechanic or bonus on kill type of reward. I think that this is ultimately a good thing, as you probably want your unlockables to feel immediately distinct from what you start with, but in some cases, TF2 weapons can require a bit more work. Sometimes, weapons poise to turn TF2 into a fighting game, requiring the player to build and burn a meter or gauge to gain their full benefits. A super meter for a pre-ultimate FPS. What's not to like? Weapons like these are pretty interesting to me, as they tend to rest somewhere between the bonus on equip and bonus on kill design philosophies within TF2's weapons. They reward you for playing well, but often only offer their boost temporarily while the meter is in play. Otherwise, they have to offer some sort of tangible difference or bonus when the meter is not in use to make equipping them worth it. In this video, I wanted to discuss every asterisk TF2 weapon with a built-in meter mechanic. I say asterisk because we're going to be omitting two very noteworthy weapon categories from this video: banners and mediguns. Banners because they gain their meter passively rather than doing damage with the banners themselves, and mediguns because despite them fitting the criteria for this video, talking about them would really over-centralize the discussion and basically turn this into an oops all medic type of video. And I'm sure nobody wants to hear that from someone whose literal least played class is medic.
You got a problem with that, you can go fuck yourself.
All that said, let's roll.
Number 4, the Galactic Sniper Champion, Sniping League.
For the first time ever in one of these weapon subcategory videos, we're actually talking about two weapons for the same class. Sniper, everyone's favorite Australian New Zealand problem child, actually has two weapons within the exact same item set that both feature a meter mechanic. It's a double sniper Expliper. we're going to be discussing the Hitman's heatmaker and the cleaner's carbine both in this video. These two weapons are interesting, as despite being designed by the same people for the same item set with similar aesthetics releasing in the same update, they don't really combo together or sync all that well outside of both featuring meters. Because of this, we'll be discussing them in two mini sections for this video rather than as a whole unit. Let's start with the heatmaker. The Hitman's heatmaker is an unlockable primary for Sniper with one main positive and one main negative. It deals 20% less damage on body shot than stock, dealing a per hit maximum of 120, which prevents it from one-shotting light classes with body shots under normal gameplay circumstances. This is obviously a pretty huge downside, as it narrows the margin of error for securing kills on Sniper pretty significantly and requires you land headshots to consistently pick important targets. As a trade-off, this weapon features a unique focus meter, which fills upon getting kills and assists with any weapon while this is equipped. After 3 kills, 9 assists, or any combination of the two, the focus meter will be filled completely, at which point the player can activate a unique buffed focus state for a maximum of 10 seconds. Within this state, the sniper's shots charge 20% faster, and he doesn't need to unscope and reload between shots. This allows him to relentlessly hammer enemies with a constant stream of faster charging rapid-fire kill shots. On top of this, the focus meter can be refilled while it's in use, allowing the player to theoretically extend it indefinitely so long as there are enemies to kill. So, funny story, I did not originally intend on talking about the heatmaker in this video due to its meter mechanics being a bit different than the other weapons we'll be discussing. I thought I'd cover the cleaner's carbine and move on to the next class. However, after testing out and starting to grab footage with the heatmaker, I found myself having a lot of fun. And then I kept using it, and using it, and using it, and then I realized I may have just found my new main sniper rifle. Like, I've referenced being bad at Sniper in a few past videos, he is easily my worst class in the game, but boy did the heatmaker reinvigorate my interest in earnestly getting good at this class. It's such a uniquely, viscerally satisfying sniper rifle that just feels exceptionally fun to use and go on rolls with. Even the 20% less damage on body shot, which would hypothetically seem like a huge negative, didn't matter much to me as it allowed me to mellow out more and focus entirely on securing important headshots. There was no more choosing whether or not to go for body shots or headshots or weighing which would be more valuable in the moment. I was just in headshot city with this thing. This is like straight up love at first use. I have had the Hitman's heatmaker for pretty much my entire 10 years playing TF2, but never earnestly gave it a whirl before this. The focus meter is such a fun, satisfying, and rewarding mechanic. Not unlike the Bazaar bargain, this weapon is effectively a direct downgrade from stock until you've secured a few kills, but unlike the Bazaar bargain, it's exceptionally lenient and forgiving. You do not need a full meter to activate focus, allowing you to use it whenever the situation may call for it, and the ability to maintain a perpetual focus charge by continuously securing kills is insanely fun. Instantly refilling your meter by headshotting some hapless out-of-position gamer without needing to unscope, and then doing it again over and over again is some of the most fun I've ever had on Sniper. I didn't even mind dealing less damage on body shot, as each kill and even assist I knew was helping towards regaining that meter. Plus, the weapon's unique cosmetic trait of decapitating enemies on headshot is just so satisfying. Helped Sniper's voice lines finally make some degree of sense.
Everything above your neck's gonna be a fine red mist.
I'm someone who tends to enjoy games the most when there's a satisfying tactile sense to the game feel, and the Hitman's heatmaker delivers on that in spades. I'm actually not a huge fan of the game feel on the stock Sniper rifle. Something about its model and firing sound just don't really click with me. It feels a little too hands-off to me, if that makes sense. But the juxtaposition of the silent, suppressed firing sound of the heatmaker contrasted against firing off big damage, head-popping kill shots tickles my brain wrinkles just right. It's so viscerally satisfying. Plus, the silencer actually does serve a gameplay purpose, as it genuinely does make your shots quieter and harder for enemies to detect. We love gameplay and aesthetic integration. Now, that's not to say that the heatmaker is perfect. Despite my glowing endorsements of it so far, there is a reason that it's not considered the crossbow or Tomislav of Sniper's primaries. The 20% less damage on body shots is obviously enormous, as stripping away Sniper's ability to insta-pick medics and enemy snipers with anything but headshots means that you've basically got to be clicking on those heads in order to help your team. If you can't consistently land headshots or clean up low health enemies, then you're basically wasting your time and energy by equipping the heatmaker. On top of that, the fact that the focus has to be gained, lost, and regained on every use makes this more of a burst-oriented sniper rifle rather than something like the Bazaar bargain, which retains its boost permanently so long as you can stay alive. Gaining the focus is more lenient and forgiving than the the Bazaar bargain, but its strength is also scaled appropriately. Both of these negatives make the heatmaker a sniper rifle that mandates and rewards consistent skill and high execution, basically being a direct downgrade from stock if you can't regularly build the focus. This will not be a sniper rifle for everyone. Lastly, activating the focus does give the gun tracer rounds, and while they're not as damning as the Machinas firing every shot as a tracer, they can still give away your position. A sniper is most useful to his team when the enemy team doesn't know where he is, so this can be a bit of a problem. All that said though, holy cow do I love this weapon. This is the most fun I've had playing sniper in ages, and is more so than any other weapon I've discussed in the Weapons Subcategory series, a newfound favorite that this series has encouraged me to use. I've briefly used the heatmaker before, but never to this extent. It's even great in MVM. If some high tour Harry gives you shit for picking sniper in 2 cities, slap explosive headshots and damage on this thing and show them how a real professional gets things done. All in all, the Hitman's heatmaker is a high-skill, high-reward primary that rewards consistently doing your job with the ability to do your job even more consistently. I hope that made sense. It's definitely a new favorite of mine and a weapon that I can see myself revisiting. I now understand why all of those cheaters and bots tend to run it. That said, we're not done with sniper, as we have one other weapon to discuss for this section, the oft-forgotten MVM staple, the cleaner's carbine. The cleaner's carbine, unlike the Hitman's heatmaker, is noteworthy because it's neither good nor fun. This is a weapon that's often in the running for most forgettable weapons in TF2, and when people are remembering it, it's usually to call it bad. It's a shame too, because it's literally the only unlockable SMG replacement in the game, which I've always felt was a bit of a missed opportunity. Regardless, maybe there is a reason that Valve started and stopped making unlockable SMGs here. Let's take a look at the cleaner's carbine. Quick aside though, I'm a bit of a stock SMG apologist. I fully realize and acknowledge its reputation as one of the worst non-melee stock weapons in the game, but I don't know guys, I'm a heavy main and fast firing sustained damage weapons just make my brain happy. There's a reason why the 2 Australiums I own are the stock minigun and the SMG. By that logic, I should love the cleaner's carbine, right? Well, at a base, the cleaner's carbine is an unlockable secondary for sniper with 2 noteworthy negatives. It features a smaller clip than stock, loading only 20 shots compared to stock's 25, and fires a fitting 25% slower than stock, giving it an all-around lower DPS despite each shot dealing the same amount of damage as stock. These 2 downsides combined result in this being a super unfun weapon to use, with the slow firing speed and microscopic clip making it feel remarkably clumsy and inaccurate in practice. Sniper's SMG is already one of the less graceful weapons in the game, and this weapon takes that lack of grace and really runs with it like a South Park parody. It makes it alarmingly difficult to secure kills with this weapon, which draws into question its role as sniper's only damage-dealing unlockable secondary. All of this is hypothetically balanced out by the carbine's main positive, which to be fair is pretty interesting. As you damage enemies with it, it steadily fills a unique crikey meter, which after dealing 100 points of damage will be filled, allowing the player to press mouse 2 and gain 8 seconds of guaranteed mini crits across the sniper's entire loadout. This is actually pretty neat, as it basically gives you 8 seconds of guaranteed loadout-wide Jarate that you can use indefinitely for its entire duration, rather than only applying it to the enemy immediately in front of you. Unlike the Jarate, it places the source of the mini crits on the sniper's weapons rather than on his enemies' bodies. This can hypothetically allow you to go on some pretty crazy rolls, especially considering that sniper may or may not have a melee weapon that deals guaranteed 195 damage crits whenever it would normally mini crit. This is actually the reason this weapon is considered meta for sniper and MVM, specifically on Rottenburg. If you bring the Bushwalker and max out its swing speed, you basically have infinite guaranteed full crit swings that can pretty quickly shred tanks with the help of another teammate. All this considered, the cleaner's carbine is, at the very least, a tantalizing weapon that can promise big rolls to someone who can use it well. However, its main problems stem from its own habits of directly contradicting itself and it conflicting with the base mechanics of sniper as a class. Because, you see, despite Jarate obviously existing and facilitating a very infamous and divisive instant kill sniper combo, sniper isn't really a combo class outside of that. Sniper is a class who specializes in hanging back and taking out targets from a distance. Anytime he's doing close quarters fighting, it's usually to deal with overly aggressive flankers who are attempting to counterpick him. To this end, the Jarate Bushwalker combo is such a powerful and controversial tool because it generally gives Sniper an easy instant win button against the most powerful flankers. It's very quick, safe, and easy to press 2, press mouse 1, press W, and press mouse 1 again. It's incredibly reliable, safe, and deletes one of Sniper's primary primary weaknesses against pretty much all flanking classes. If you'll notice, most flanking classes in TF2, with exception to maybe Roamer Soldier, tend to have less than 195 HP. By comparison, the Cleaner's Carbine requires that a sniper either actively place himself out of position, engaging in frontline fighting that he is not physically equipped for, or slowly and methodically shoot flankers with this gun's pitiful DPS to gain the crikey in order to earn its only positive. Despite 8 seconds of guaranteed loadout-wide mini-crits being very strong, this item is designed in such a way that means you'll basically have to be making concessions to use it, and I make enough concessions at work. You're giving up either the reliable safety and speed of the Jarate or the higher and more consistent DPS of the stock SMG for a gun that just offers a slower version of what both of those weapons do better. The bonus of being able to use a sniper rifle with the mini crits is kind of counterbalanced by an uncharged quickscope mini crit body shot dealing a massive 68 damage, and a headshot being a guaranteed critical either way. You can't even argue that it mitigates the body shot damage reduction on the Hitman's Heatmaker, which is this weapon's intended combo, due to the fact that you're still dealing less damage on body shot than you would with stock either way. Sniper is not designed in a way to facilitate big damage close range combos outside of the much better Jarate Bushwalker failsafe. On to what I said about this weapon being at odds with itself, the requirement of needing to deal 100 damage with a gun that deals approximately 10 every geological period is definitely a bit counterintuitive. Considering that we just talked about a gun in the same item set as this one that builds its meter with kills and assists across any of Sniper's weapons, it makes this one seem especially counterproductive. Maybe if this gun had something like a rate of fire ramp up where its firing speed gets faster the longer you hold down M1, it'd be a bit better, but as is, it's just kind of underwhelming. Why would you bother trying to deal 100 damage in one life with a gun that barely deals any for mini crits when Jarate is an option in the exact same slot on the exact same class? The argument of Jarate having a recharge time doesn't really come into play when you realize how lengthy and dangerous the process of building the crikey meter is. All in all, the Cleaner's Carbine is a disappointing weapon, just like me to my parents. It's got a cool design, a fun risk versus reward concept, and an all-around badass aesthetic, yet it's hampered almost entirely by its primary job being filled by a much better weapon in the exact same item slot, and its overall feel and flow being incredibly clumsy and inaccurate. I would love to see Valve add another unlockable SMG to the game, as I feel as though it's a woefully underrepresented weapon category, but if all of them would end up feeling like the Carbine, then maybe I can understand the lack of them.
Fanta!
Root beer!
Pepsi! Coca-Cola!
Spart.
We've officially exited the sniper hole and have found ourselves stumbling into the scout pit. Scout is in an interesting position compared to sniper for this list, as while sniper's meter-based weapons were either perfectly fun if gimmicky side grades to just straight up downgrades, Scout's meter-based weapon is arguably one of the most powerful primary weapons in the game. It's often in the discussion for best unlockable weapons on offer to any class, and is even banned in competitive for being too over-centralizing. The Soda Popper. The Soda Popper is one of my personal favorite weapons in the game. It's a remarkably fun, fluid, powerful, and dynamic weapon that succeeds in neither being too similar to the stock scattergun, nor just a gimmicky novelty. It's among my favorite weapons in the game, and is my personal favorite scout primary on offer. But what makes the Soda Popper so fun? Let's dive in. The Soda Popper is an unlockable scattergun for Scout with a few very noteworthy distinctions. It's a double-barrel sawed-off shotgun, allowing it to fire only twice before needing to reload. As a trade-off, it both reloads and fires significantly faster than all of its contemporaries, offsetting its only listed negative and facilitating a rapid-fire burst damage playstyle. On top of that, the Soda Popper features a unique hype meter mechanic, which by dealing damage with this gun equipped, the Scout can steadily gain hype. After dealing 350 damage across any of Scout's weapons, Scout can activate the hype meter, granting him an additional 5 mid-air jumps for a 10-second period. This has a myriad of uses, from throwing off enemies in fights, to mobility and map traversal, to flanking, to everything in between. Already, it should be easy to see what makes the Soda Popper so great. Compared to the stock scattergun, its rapid firing speed and powerful punch-like close-range attacks can easily shred most targets at mid to close range, and with it dealing a maximum ramp-up damage of 105 per shot across a 0.3 second attack interval, it can really get out some insane damage very quickly. More so than any other scout primary, the Soda Popper facilitates an extremely fast, active, mobile, non-committal, and flexible scout playstyle, with the player being capable of getting in, railroading an enemy with back-to-back 105 damage shots, and getting out just as quickly. The 66% smaller clip size, which is its only listed negative, doesn't really matter when you're firing and reloading faster than every other gun at a base level. This weapon really is the dictionary definition of a side grade, as it functions entirely separate from stock, without too much mechanical overlap outside of also being a shotgun on scout. What's neat too is that the meter is entirely secondary on this weapon. Like, yeah, the hype is obviously extremely strong, and we'll discuss that in a bit, but with how strong and distinct this weapon is from stock, it could probably flourish entirely on its own merits without the meter or any additional bells and whistles. It's such a fun, dynamic, and strong weapon, and one that really opens up unlimited potential for scout as a class. The only thing keeping this from being an entirely over-centralizing best-in-slot pick is that it's a scout primary and that the stock scattergun exists in the same slot. Without the stiff item competition, this would be in clear contention for one of the best primary weapons in the game. So yeah, even before discussing the meter, the soda popper is already a standout weapon that easily serves as one of the best unlockable primaries available to any class. It pretty much entirely lacks a unique or tangible downside, and could probably pass for a stock weapon if you remove the meter and cleaned up its design a little bit. It's such a fun, fundamental, and powerful weapon for scout, and an easy choice for one of my favorites in the game. But what about the meter? Is this weapon truly worth the hype? Well, yeah. This weapon is already incredibly strong, so adding a wholly unique bonus mechanic on top of that is what really pushes it into potentially overpowered territory. The hype meter is deceptively strong, as dealing 350 damage with any of Scout's weapons really isn't that difficult thanks to this weapon's rapid-fire damage output, and the Scout's plethora of secondary and melee damage over time utilities, and the utility of 6 midair jumps is more layered than you might think. For one, it makes this weapon an incredibly effective projectile counter. Against classes like Soldier, who rely a lot on splash damage, and Demo Man, whose direct hits are intrinsically harder to land, this weapon is pretty much a dedicated screw you button. Just land a few shots and then start flying around them as they desperately scramble to find a way to land a single crumb of splash damage on you. It puts the control and flow of the fight into the Scout's hands, which is the inverse of how these types of exchanges usually tend to be. Always fun to stick it to Metaslave competitive Soldier mains, who, as we all know, are the only real snowflakes of the TF2 community. And let's say you do get hit by a big damage splash rocket or direct hit pipe. Well, you've still got hype left, so you can just make like Poochie and return to your home planet. Just start flying away with your remaining jumps and leave your dumbfounded enemies in the dust. Assuming you survive, the very worst case scenario is that you've distracted the enemy with the potential for damage or picks along the way. Plus, map navigation becomes significantly easier with the hype, as thanks to TF2's general map design philosophies, 6 jumps is usually more than enough to clear any gap or reach any specific piece of high ground you need to get to. The hype meter is all around one of the most potent and unique bonuses in TF2, and one that's uses and utility have so many more layers than you might think. The soda popper used to give you guaranteed mini crits for its hype, which was definitely good, but I'd say that this is just as good in an entirely different way. You can really never complain about on-command, unparalleled mobility. So yeah, the soda popper is definitely very good. This weapon would already be incredibly strong and useful without the hype meter, but the addition of a unique playstyle facilitating additional mechanic really helped makes it a true standout within the game. I honestly think it could do with maybe one additional downside, maybe a 10% damage penalty or damage vulnerability bump while the hype is active, because as is, it's a damn near over-centralizing scout weapon that's only kept from being broken by the extreme competition in its item slot. It's all in all one of the best unlockable weapons in the game, and a clear winner out of everything we've discussed in this video. If you're in the camp who thinks that removing its old guaranteed mini crits for running stat with some debilitating nerf, then I'd encourage you to try it out because it's still most certainly very strong. This soda is definitely not diet.
Don't make me play Strange, please! Please! Please don't make me play Strange!
Please stop making me use the phlogistinator. Y'all could have voted for the head collecting weapons for this video, but no, we just had to talk about meters. And while this video did help me find a new favorite on sniper and gave me a reason to record one of my favorite scout weapons, the unfortunate shadow of the phlog was always hanging over this project. I've made it no mistake in previous videos that I am not a fan of this weapon, as I find that it boasts the devastating combination of being anti-fun to use, very bad, and damn near dangerous for new players to stumble across. But for this video, let's focus on it entirely from a gameplay and practicality perspective. The phlogistinator is an unlockable flamethrower for pyro that boasts the same firing speed, damage, afterburn duration, and afterburn damage as the stock flamethrower. As you deal damage with it, however, you steadily build up a unique meter, which when filled can allow the pyro to activate a special taunt that grants around 8 seconds of guaranteed full crits. It's technically 10 seconds, but the length of the taunt is subtracted from this total. As a primary and gargantuan trade-off, this weapon cannot air blast, which makes it a purely damage-oriented flamethrower with very little in the ways of team utility, combo play, or any advanced pyro tech. Talking about the meter first, the oomph meter is definitely an appealing stat. It only costs 300 damage to fill completely or killing a single full health heavy, and the 8 seconds of guaranteed crits is definitely a tantalizing bonus for that. On top of that, the pyro becomes completely immune to both damage and knockback while using the taunt, making it useful as a last resort swan song tool when you're near death. When combined with a medic, an uber, an overheal, or just backing support of your team, running over an entire hapless team of enemies as they desperately try to deal enough damage before being melted can be really satisfying. It's inarguably one of the most effective full team counters when the chips stack precisely in your favor and the enemy team is exceptionally uncoordinated. On top of that, gaining the meter isn't that difficult. If you play conservatively and only take attacks of opportunity while pecking at enemies with things like the scorch shot or detonator, you can theoretically fill it very quickly and safely. The meter builds from any source of fire damage, so contrary to the belief of some players, you do not need to thrust yourself into unsafe situations to gain it. The phlog operates in distinct phases, with the oomph building phase being very passive and the using phase being very aggressive. So that's all well and good. The phlog is a weapon that allows the player to dynamically shift between passive and aggressive playstyles while taking advantage of its primary benefits and playing around its negatives. That's obviously all fine. All that said, I really hate this weapon. Even removed from its role as a bad learning tool for new players, it's simply not a fun weapon to use more times than it is. I know that I main heavy, who is infamously one of the most linear and simple classes in the game, but the phlog is a bit too simple and linear even for me. For one, you get absolutely fucked by soldiers, demos, and anyone smart enough to shoot an encroaching pyro while using this thing. One big secret about TF2 is that pyro is a close-range sustained damage class with damage ramp-up, so in a lot of cases, you can outdamage a pyro closing the distance on you by shooting them with close-range burst damage weapons before they can kill you. Instead of running away, just shoot them. In a lot of cases, the pyro can simply air blast you to throw off your aim or reflect your projectiles if need be, but in the case of the phlog, you just gotta shoot them. A shotgun, rocket launcher, grenade launcher, minigun, they all do more burst damage faster than the phlog if you can land your shots. And considering that a pyro using this thing will likely be walking directly at you, that shouldn't be too difficult. On top of that, this weapon flips Pyro's usual class counter dynamics on their head. Pyro is generally a super effective counter to Soldier and Demoman thanks to Air Blast being able to redirect potentially team-wiping splash damage, but in the case of the phlog, Soldier becomes your hard counter, as he effortlessly juggles you before you can close the distance on him. Your only option for close-range damage using the phlog is to hold M1 and continue walking at people, which is really easy to counter. You cannot displace, throw off, or dissuade enemies from shooting you while using this. Lastly, and most importantly, this weapon completely strips away Pyro's class-defining team utility. Not being able to extinguish teammates, man-melter exempt, makes Pyro feel like an exceptionally useless class to your team, and being completely unable to disconnect Ubers and reflect oncoming damage makes this all-around an incredibly selfish flamethrower. I don't know if you remember, but there's a certain T-word in this game's title that might make this a bit more problematic than it would be in any other game. You just kinda have to stand there and shrug while your teammates burn to death and get run over by Ubers around you. All in all, the phlogistinator is a weapon that poises to make Pyro an incredibly potent close-range damage dealer, yet narrows their skill set so significantly to do it that it might as well turn them into a truck. You can steer into enemies and run them over, yet you're so lumbering and predictable while doing it that most enemies should be able to get out of the way with more than enough time to spare. If you want to hear more about my thoughts on the phlog and its general role in the game as an unlockable weapon, I'd recommend checking out my Beginner's Trap Weapons video as I discuss it in more detail and from different perspectives there. As is, I'm more than ready to be done discussing this weapon and using it for a good length of time. I know some people really like it, and I know my views on it may give some people the impression that I feel as though it's overpowered, but trust me, it's exactly the opposite. This is one of my least favorite weapons in the game, and one that I think most serious Pyro players are better off not using. Phlogiston isn't even real, guys. So, how did I end up feeling about TF2's meter building weapons? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Two of them wound up being some of my least favorite weapons in the entire game. The Phlog and Carbine are both remarkably unfun and clumsy to use effectively, and their meters don't really make up for it. By contrast, the Hitman's Heatmaker and especially Soda Popper are both extremely fun and fluid to use, with the Soda Popper specifically being one of Scout's most notable weapons, meter or not. And that ultimately leads to two things I noticed. One is that the weapons that meters granted more than just more damage or crits tended to be more interesting than the ones that just gave you bigger numbers for dealing damage. Two is that TF2's meter building and burning weapons, despite the meters being their most noteworthy traits, often aren't defined entirely by the meters. Either for positive or negative reasons, these weapons generally tend to have traits that outshine the existences of their building mechanics. For the Phlog and Carbine, it's because they're bad. For the Heatmaker, it's because it's very fun and satisfying. And for the Soda Popper, well, I think we've covered that enough already. All things considered, I'm definitely a fan of this design mentality within TF2, and I feel as though there's room for a meter weapon that could really go whole hog with the whole fighting game super-esque design mentality. Give a class a really big move with flashy effects and big damage, and you know what, I'm just talking about the miniguns now. Just make a TF2 fighting game. Thanks, hope y'all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch y'all later. Cheers! Let's not mince words here. Medics are hard to come by in casual TF2. While most players might agree he's inarguably the most important class in the game for a team to have, most players in casual really don't want to bite the bullet and pick him. They'd rather be the 4th scout or the 3rd spy on their team than the 1st medic. Because of this, TF2 actually does feature a few weapons that allow non-healing classes to fill medic's role. Weapons that offer on-command support and self-sustain for classes who otherwise don't specialize in it. In this video, I want to talk about some of these weapons. I find them pretty interesting, as they pretty much exist entirely to cover the relative rarity of medics in casual. That said, I also want to stress what we're actually going to be talking about in this video. There are a lot of TF2 weapons that feature healing as a mechanic, so to narrow the discussion a bit, I'll be focusing entirely on weapons that offer healing as their primary or only use aside from doing damage. For instance, the Conqueror, Cozy Camper, and Back Scratcher all feature healing as bonuses, but have additional perks that may incentivize you to use them for something more than just the health. I want to focus on weapons that feature healing as their primary mechanics for the sake of this video. All that said, let's roll.
I'd say, come again? And then I'd laugh because I said, come.
The first weapon for the video, and we're already demonetized. Off to a good start. For real though, the Mad Milk is pretty neat. Even putting aside all of our epic jabroni Mike bodily fluid jokes, it's still one of the most popular and respected scout weapons in the game. Despite being a very widely used and ubiquitous weapon within Scout's lineup, I can't recall a single time I've ever seen someone complain about it or posture that it's overpowered. It's a remarkably unbothered weapon, and one that I can't really take any umbrage with. It's also hilarious. But why is that? The Mad Milk is an unlockable throwable secondary weapon for Scout. It's a jar of a mysterious quote-unquote non-milk substance, which can be thrown at enemies, not unlike the sniper's Jarate. Upon hitting an enemy or surface, the jar explodes, splashing the mysterious contents within onto all enemies in its immediate vicinity for 10 seconds. During this time, 60% of all damage done to the sodden victims is returned to the attackers as health. So if you deal 100 damage, you'll be instantly healed for 60. After being thrown, the Mad Milk will be placed on a 20-second recharge timer, which can be shortened to 16 by extinguishing a teammate with it. Enemies can only remove the mysterious non-milk substance by being healed for an extended period of time, being ubered, charging, or submerging themselves in water. Anyone milked is also afflicted with visible dripping liquid particles, and a white droplet icon is placed on their HUD to let them know that they're currently drenched. Anyone on the Scout's team can take advantage of a soaked victim, making this weapon great for enabling big plays in team fights. Now, I know what we're all thinking. Boy, is that nasty. There definitely is a reason why everyone names their Mad Milk some kind of disgusting white liquid joke, but it is worth noting that this weapon's publicity blurb mentions it being radioactive cow's milk and not the alternative, so at least your mind can rest at ease. Doesn't mean we're not all still gonna make jokes though. Personally, mine is called Wind Up Tifa, because she's in there somewhere. Jokes aside, this is such a bizarrely irreverent concept for a weapon in TF2 to have, a game that already features multiple piss-based mechanics, and the intentional smoke around it really only adds to that, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's very funny. As for its actual mechanics, the Mad Milk is one of the more uniquely designed weapons in TF2. It's one of 3 soaking weapons in the game, and is, in my opinion, one that offers a bonus that rests comfortably between the Jarate and the Gas Passer in terms of usefulness. Being able to guarantee on-command healing to yourself and teammates is inarguably very useful, and can really help push your team to victory in team fights that may have otherwise been much tighter. 60% is a huge percentage of health to return with each shot, and it can really help you survive situations that you might not have had any chance to otherwise. Keep in mind that 2 max damage meat shots of the scattergun will heal enough to fully recover your entire HP pool with this weapon. That's not to say that it's only useful as a team support tool, however, as in cases where you're being singled out by a particularly aggressive enemy, be it a 1v1 or a 1v12, tossing the Mad Milk at the beginning of a fight can really be the linchpin to your survival. Against tanky classes like Heavy and Soldier, the added self-sustain can help you stay in the fight longer and clutch out what would have assuredly been guaranteed losses without it. Plus, if you just toss it on some enemies and then piss off during a team fight, then you'll start seeing entirely unearned kill assists stack up like debts to an unusual trader. Your team will always appreciate having a group of enemies be milked in this entirely safe for work context, so liberal use of this item is encouraged. This really is a universally useful weapon that's not really a bad option to bring at any point, and is only kept from being a must pick by Scout having an incredibly stacked lineup of secondaries. On top of that, this weapon is a super effective counter to both Spy and Pyro. As a soaking throwable, it makes exposing and tracking Cloak spies a breeze, and even though it doesn't short out the spy's cloak like the Jarate, it's still easier to track a bunch of floating milk droplet particles than it is an invisible spy. As for Pyro, this weapon can be used to quickly and easily extinguish yourself or teammates, which is especially huge on Scout due to his low health pool and close range fighting style, making Pyro a pretty effective kryptonite to him. Your recharge timer is reduced when using this weapon to extinguish teammates, so you should never be afraid to do it. Lastly, as a soaking throwable, you don't have to direct hit enemies of the jar to make the most out of it. The splash has a 200 hammer unit radius, so just blind tossing this item in the general direction of a crowd of enemies can be more than enough to ensure some mileage. I do find its arc a bit trickier to aim than the Jarate's, but I think that's just a me problem. As always though, there are a few downsides to this weapon, and I'm not just talking about the shame that comes with filling the jar. For one, the 20-second recharge timer is kind of huge. Despite this weapon being most helpful when used liberally, you do have to exercise some degree of picky choosiness with when, how, and why you use it, as it'll be out of commission for a pretty sizable length of time after each use. If you want to use it to tough out a team fight, then you might not have it to extinguish yourself later on. If you want to extinguish yourself or a teammate, then you won't have it to provide support during your next fight. Using the Mad Milk is very committal, and it can be tricky to find the best times to use it. In addition, this weapon competes pretty heavily with some other very strong options in Scout's secondary slot. With exception to maybe the Winger, Scout doesn't really have a bad secondary, and the myriad of uses that each of them have can lead to situations where the Mad Milk simply isn't the best option. I'd say it's one of Scout's more universally useful secondaries, but there are situations where other options will flourish more. It's kind of a jack off of all trades, masturbate of none kind of item. Wait, what? Sometimes, having the damage of the pistols, the buffs of the sodas, or the damage over time of the cleaver will help more in taking out important targets. But even with that, the Mad Milk is all around a universally powerful scout weapon and one of the most consistently useful utility secondaries in the game. It's a weapon that nobody would ever complain about having on their side, and I can personally say that I've never been horribly annoyed to be hit by it. It doesn't really tip the scales into being overpowered or over-centralizing, it's just kind of an overall strong and unbothered scout item that can fit snugly into pretty much any loadout. I honestly really like that about it, that a weapon with one of the most irreverent and objectionable concepts in the game is one of the least offensive in terms of its balance. You really never hear anyone complain about the Mad Milk. It's one of the most unbothered, staying in its lane type weapons in the game, and I'm honestly all here for it. Also, it's cum.
or you can trade it all in for what's in this box.
The box! The box!
From a relatively unbothered weapon to one of the most contentious in the game. The black box, our second weapon for this video, is noteworthy for facilitating one of the most contentious and widely hated playstyles in the game. It's been called a wide variety of things, from a crutch to broken to brain dead to a bunch of other interchangeable negative gamer words that don't mean anything, and you'll be happy to know that I bit the bullet and earnestly used this weapon for an extended period of time for this video. And honestly, I don't really get it.
Well, if it's any consolation, I actually don't really care.
Well, that's not the attitude to have.
I know, well, I just figured I'd be honest with you.
Let's talk at length about the black box. The black box is an unlockable rocket launcher for Soldier with one of the most simple stat lineups in the game. You know the deal though, simplicity can be deceptive, just ask Pot of Greed. The black box's rockets travel at the same speed and deal the same amount of damage as stock. Its primary and only positive stat is that it heals the player for up to 20 health for every successfully landed rocket, with the healing being equivalent to 1 point of health for every 4.5 points of damage, capping out at 20 healing when damaging for over 90. This makes the black box a super effective self-sustaining weapon during 1v1s, and a clear choice for a soldier who struggles to stay alive. As a deceptively large trade-off, the black box loads one fewer rocket per clip than stock, allowing only 3 shots before needing to reload. This affects more than you would probably think, as 1 less rocket equates to 1/4 less damage over time, rocket jumps, shots in fights, and even healing per clip. Right off the bat, the black box may seem like either an incredibly strong or incredibly terrible weapon based on where your priorities lie on Soldier. The up to 20 extra health per shot can inarguably help you tough out fights that you may have otherwise crumpled in, and the fact that the healing is based on the overall damage each rocket does rather than the amount of damage it does individually to each target means that blind firing into groups of enemies can yield surprisingly large health numbers. In tough or tricky fights, the healing provided by the black box can be the linchpin that you may need to pull out a clutch victory. It gives you passive lifesteal on a class that's inarguably one of the best damage dealers in the game. However, all of those positives are immediately and fiercely counteracted by one of the most deceptively crushing downsides in the game. The 1 less rocket per clip is absolutely gargantuan. It might not seem like much, but make no mistake, Soldier lives and dies by his clip, and the lengthy reload combined with the committal nature of firing a single rocket means that having any less shots can really mess up your flow. 1 less rocket removes 1/4 of your damage output in fights, so your overall DPS is significantly lower, you have 1 less rocket jump for loadouts, and it even affects this weapon's playstyle defining healing. There is an argument to be made that the healing might not be that important in sustained fights, when you'd likely have been able to win either way with the additional rocket and damage. That obviously depends heavily on the overall match and game state, but it's something to consider. Because of these two factors, I generally consider the black box to be purely a side grade that's positives are directly and proportionately balanced out by its negatives. This is a weapon that rests as a pure and uncomfortable 50-50 on the bad to broken scale, with its positives and negatives counteracting each other and keeping them in check in equal measures. For such a contentious weapon, it honestly strikes me as one of the more thoughtfully balanced in the game. Its self-healing can be incredibly strong, and it's definitely frustrating to lose a fight because of that possible 20 health difference, but arguing that the 1 less rocket isn't a huge downside is fighting a losing battle. Back onto a general discussion of this weapon's stats, the self-healing's overall effectiveness and utility depends heavily on the situation you're applying it in. In more structured, coordinated game states or game modes, like 1v1s, MGE, or competitive, where moment-to-moment damage number calculations can make huge differences, it's inarguably very strong. Up to 20 extra health is a deceptively large value in TF2, especially on Soldier, and can be just what you need to survive what would otherwise be very close battles. That said, in less coordinated environments like team fights and most of casual, I find the self-healing to matter a little bit less. Like when there's a large amount of sustained focus fire coming from all sides, 20 extra health every second or so, capping out at 60 before needing to reload, doesn't make that big of a difference. When you've got 2 teams of 12 bearing down on each other rather than 2 coordinated teams or singular players, 20 health isn't as big of a deal. It can definitely still help, but you're much more apt to be outdamaged in these environments. There are situations where the utility of the extra damage and 1 extra rocket may shine a bit more brightly than the personal self-healing. Back to what I said at the beginning of this section, the black box facilitates what's inarguably one of the most contentious and hated playstyles in TF2. Players view a soldier with the ability to passively heal himself as incredibly degenerate and unfun to fight against, and after giving it an extended play period for this video, all I have to say is...
Everybody hates me because of you!
Fenton, shut up!
Alright, shut up! And you stop your weaselly little crying! Now!
Like, if you're a competitive player, an MGE player, or someone who takes damage values deathly seriously in this game, I get it. 20 extra health every shot can be a tricky thing to contend with. But in casual, where I feel like people are most apt to use this weapon, there are answers to it. Sustained focused fire and coordinated team attacks handily beat it, and even if that's not possible, the soldier will be incredibly vulnerable after firing only 3 shots. If you can pay attention and play around that, you'll be just fine. Again, I earnestly view the black box as one of the more thoughtfully designed weapons in TF2, and one that doesn't deserve anywhere near the vitriol it gets, as its positive and negative stats really do balance each other out quite well. The healing can definitely help, but there are concrete answers and counterplay to it that I feel some people willfully ignore. If you can count how many shots the soldier is firing, you can counter accordingly. It's not the most fun to fight against, but it's far from broken, degenerate, or evil. Unless the soldier is using the Conqueror with it, but that's a story for another day.
Some people fuck at funerals. I cut off heads.
Onto our third weapon, the half-zatoichi. This is actually the first demo man weapon we're discussing in the Weapons Subcategory series, and I know what you might be thinking. Isn't this weapon also usable on soldier? And all I have to say to that is, it sure is, son. It sure is. Nah, for real though, the half-zatoichi is technically a multi-class weapon, but it's very transparently designed to be used primarily on Demo Knight, and is pretty much just a gimmicky novelty on soldier. For the purposes of this video, we'll be discussing it mostly as a Demo Knight weapon. That said, onto its stats. The half-zatoichi is an unlockable sword melee weapon for Demo Man and Soldier. Just like Demo Man's other swords, it features a 75% slower switch speed and a 50% larger melee range compared to his other weapons, making it Soldier's only weapon with a switch speed penalty and one of only 2 he has with a longer range. As for its unique traits, it instantly heals the player for 50% of their maximum HP on kill, with the HP restored being proportional to the player's max HP at the time they get the kill. For example, a stock soldier heals 100, whereas a battalion soldier heals 110. In addition, this weapon features a unique dual mechanic, where players wielding it can instantly kill each other with a single melee swing. As a primary trade-off, this weapon is quote-unquote honor-bound, requiring either a kill or a 50 health penalty to switch after deploying it. If you're below 50 HP and haven't gotten a kill, it can't be holstered at all. This makes it incredibly committal on Soldier and Hybrid Knight, yet basically downside free on Demo Knight. So, like I said, this weapon is pretty much nothing more than a gimmicky novelty on regular Demo Man and especially Soldier. Neither of them are melee combat oriented or fast enough to comfortably close the distance on enemies and secure the kill required to holster it, and the honor-bound mechanic, combined with its slower switch speed, takes away their ability to combo it effectively with other weapons to secure kills. Unlike something like the Market Gardener, a soldier can't safely rocket jump in and quickly rocket jump out to escape should he fail to kill someone. The sword-wide lack of random critical hits means you'll always have to land at least 2 swings to kill a full health target, and the 50% max health heal can't really offset how committal and unsafe this weapon is in the hands of an ordinary gun-wielding soldier. It can definitely be fun to whip out as a surprise mix-up, but there's not much practicality to it beyond that. That's not to say that it's all bad though. You may have noticed that I said a regular Demo Man and Hybrid Knight a bit ago, and the reason for that is because this is an incredibly strong pure Demo Knight weapon. From my experience, this is the only sword that can really consistently rival the Eyelander as the best and most consistent Demo Knight melee on offer. On a subclass that does not need to switch weapons, is fast and tanky by default, and has access to an on-command burst movement option that also grants damage, pretty much all of its downsides disappear. It doesn't have the negative base of the Eyelander, the increased self-damage of the Claymore, or the redundancy of the Persian Persuader. On Demo Knight, this is a purely and wholly beneficial weapon with no downsides outside of not offering the other sword's positives. To put it simply, you can survive some absolutely wacky shit with this thing. You can get away with kills and rolls that a purely melee-oriented subclass in a gun-based FPS simply should not be able to. Being able to dart from enemy to enemy, rack up kill after kill, healing, potentially overhealing with each target taken down, and getting out when the going gets rough thanks to your constantly refilling health, brings a level of satisfaction that is unparalleled in TF2. With the Demo Knight boots, you'll be healing 100 health with each kill, and if you know to prioritize squishy targets who can efficiently defend themselves at point-blank range, you can easily out-heal your enemy's damage in a very comfortable fashion. If you ever find yourself one swing away from a target and are getting low on health personally, just keep on swinging. If you land that kill, you'll be in tip-top shape again and can continue your role in no time. This weapon is simply unrivaled in terms of the endurance and sustainability it grants Demo Knight. Even though it lacks the Islander's increased health and movement speed on kill, it can single-handedly facilitate an incredibly aggressive tanking Demo Knight playstyle that may just be more beneficial than the Islander depending on the map, game state, and enemy team composition. If you combo it with the Tide Turner, which grants you seamless turning and refills most of your charge meter on kill, you can basically become a murderous ping-pong ball that bounces between enemies like a stone teenager looking for a store that stocks Funyuns. It's very fun. All in all, the half-zatoichi is an incredibly fun, damn near overpowered weapon when used on Demo Knight, with an effective, complete lack of downsides and a purely beneficial line of stats. When used on traditional classes, though, it's pretty much the exact opposite, and only really serves as a gimmicky mix-up tool that crumples once enemies know you have it. It's an incredibly black and white design that's effectiveness hinges entirely on what context you are using it in. I know that this section was comparatively short within the Weapons Subcategory series, but this really is a very simple and very effective weapon. If you're fiercely married to the Islander as your primary Demo Knight sword, I'd strongly recommend giving the half-zatoichi a try and go on some honor-bound duels. I promise you'll cause more death than dishonor.
The best that he can! Also, he's a ninja.
Without a doubt, the most controversial thing I've done since returning full-time to the TF2 sphere was in the first episode of the Weapons Subcategory series. In the skill-dependent weapons video, I made the bold and controversial decision to include the conniver's kunai for spy within the list of items for the video. Some people did not like this, as the kunai is pretty widely considered to be one of the most powerful and over-centralizing unlocks in the game, and my claim that it was at all skill-intensive did not sit well with some people. So now that we're a bit away from that, has my opinion on the kunai changed?
No! No, man! No, man! No! I don't think so! I don't think so!
Can you guys tell I've been watching home movies recently? Look, I'll concede that this weapon is very strong, but I also thoroughly believe that it's not a weapon for every situation, or an entirely over-centralizing best-in-slot pick. Let's dive into its stats. The conniver's kunai is an unlockable knife for spy. It boasts the unique trait of making the spy start out each life with 55 less HP, for a maximum of 70, or the lowest base health possible for any class under the game's normal rules. This makes the spy susceptible to one-shots from virtually every form of burst damage in the game. As a primary positive, it gives the spy's backstabs a very potent lifesteal effect, with him sapping up to 210 HP of overheal with each stab. This brings the spy from being the frailest class in the game to the second tankiest. Getting a stab also cleanses the spy of all negative damage dealing debuffs like fire and bleed. Already, this should immediately strike you as a weapon that exists only in extremes. Fresh out of spawn, a spy wielding this weapon is walking around as the single frailest and weakest player-controlled force in the game. The amount of things that can comfortably one-shot you is pretty staggering. For reference, here's a full list of every weapon in the game that can one-shot you while using this weapon without a crit, which cannot one-shot you with another knife. Every scout primary, every soldier primary, every shotgun except the rescue ranger, every grenade launcher, every damaging sticky bomb launcher, the Scotsman skull cutter, the warrior spirit, a long-range crusader's crossbow bolt, the shot and shot, and for good measure, the enforcer if the spy is disguised. To put it simply, a spy using the kunai gives each life at an objective, clear, and massive disadvantage. The vast majority of damage-dealing weapons in the game can comfortably kill him in a matter of moments. Now, to be completely fair and honest, this shouldn't matter too much in the case of Spy specifically. Spy is a class designed to sneak around and deceive the enemy team, and isn't likely to spend too much time engaging in close-range gunfights and not going for backstabs. At pretty much every moment of the average Spy player's game plan, they're going to be actively pursuing their next stab. On top of that, Spy does have access to the Dead Ringer, which is explicitly designed to help him survive and skirt what would otherwise be sure death scenarios. Being so frail as Spy does not matter as much as it would on other classes. That said, it's still inarguably a massive downside and one that cannot be ignored. If you're caught out without your Dead Ringer, you're dead. That aside, this weapon's primary positive is also inarguably very, very strong. As I said, a spy doing their job will likely be actively fishing for their next stab at every possible moment, and being rewarded for landing one with a 210 health overheal is definitely incredibly generous. After landing a single stab, you're potentially rocking more health than a soldier, and still have the ability to secure more stabs, your cloak, and the ability to either go for a roll or safely escape to fall back on. Spy as a class has the tools to adeptly capitalize on a buff like this, so fishing for a stab when you're at low health or being actively pursued by an enemy can be the perfect get out of jail free card. This is one of the more controversial things about the kunai, its potential to enable spies to survive sure death scenarios by stealing a cheeky stab off of a wayward out of position teammate. I'll admit, it can be frustrating to chase a spy on a death's door only to have him escape by backstabbing a gibbous soldier and suddenly being perfectly healthy again. On top of that, the kunai can absolutely facilitate some insane rolls and chain stabs. Not unlike what I said about the half-zatoichi a bit ago, you can survive some pretty gnarly shit with this thing. However, is that really a bad thing? Like, it's a knife designed to make Spy the weakest class in the game, but give him lifesteal on kill. It exists purely in extremes, and then we get mad at it for doing what it's designed for? I don't know, it seems a bit strange to me. Why is it balanced for a demo knight with the half-zatoichi to do literally the exact same thing on a tankier and more mobile class, but this is considered unacceptable? Aside from that, this is a knife that prioritizes a careful balancing act between conservative and hyper-aggro play. You have to be patient, safe, and picky enough with your engagements to not immediately be caught out and killed, yet aggressive and active enough to secure stabs and take advantage of the health buff. This is a knife that could potentially come off as incredibly counterintuitive, but in reality, it mandates thoughtful attacks of opportunity more than any other knife except the Your Eternal Reward. If you play too passively, then you might as well not be using this knife, yet if you play too carelessly, you'll likely be dying more than you'll be stabbing. And this is ultimately why I don't view the conniver's kunai as an overpowered, brain-dead, or broken weapon. It is most certainly strong and can facilitate some insane plays, but it's also a weapon that requires that you play it rather than playing spy. Using the kunai is effectively a sub-playstyle in and of itself, and requires playing spy in a very specific half-passive, half-aggressive way to get the most out of it. It is not a knife for every situation or game state, which separates it from other best-in-slot picks like the Sandwich or Crusader's crossbow. I will absolutely concede that this weapon is incredibly strong and potentially anti-fun to fight against, but I have trouble viewing it with the outward vitriol that a lot of other people tend to. It's a strong, rewarding weapon, but one that ultimately does not reward every playstyle. Also, he's a ninja.
I hope you're prepared for an unforgettable luncheon.
And for the last section of this video, let's do something a little wacky. Let's talk about an entire weapon subcategory rather than an item within it. This is a section about Heavy's lunchbox items. These things need no introduction. They're some of the most ubiquitous, widely known, and often used weapons in TF2. If you ask the average person who's only familiar with TF2 through Gmod and SFM to name 10 things about the game, the fat guy with the sandwich would probably not be too far down the list. These items are a core part of TF2's identity. Let's talk about why. Heavy has 3 healing lunchbox items in the game, and they all work as follows. They're all secondary weapons, which replace the Heavy shotguns, are all food, and all share a few traits. They all require a taunt to use, at which point the Heavy will spend roughly 4.3 seconds eating them, while releasing a very funny voice clip. Afterwards, they'll all be placed on a cooldown timer. Where they differ is in their individual effects. The Sandwich heals Heavy fully over its eating duration, healing for 300 health and then being placed on a 30-second cooldown. It can be thrown to teammates to act as a medium health kit. The Dagger bar heals Heavy for 100 health, but grants him 50 additional max health on top of that for 30 seconds. It can be thrown to teammates to act as a small health pack and takes 10 seconds to recharge. The second banana heals the Heavy for 200 health over its duration, and shares both its recharge timer and health pack size with the Dagger bar. All 3 have their recharge timer instantly refilled upon picking up any size health pack, and all drop as healing items for enemies if they're killed while in the Heavy's hands. So, unlike every other weapon in this video, which all featured a lifesteal or heal on kill effect, the lunchbox items are purely support and sustain-oriented healing items that cannot deal damage to enemies. It doesn't take much detective work to figure out why items like this would be a perfect fit for Heavy. He's a slow, damage-soaking tank that's designed to be an anchor for his team, giving him the capability of on-command self-sustain or the ability to directly burst heal his teammates is a no-brainer that helps him be less reliant on health packs and medic support. Heavy doesn't doesn't really need his shotgun, and these weapons are what enable him to be played as a standalone class, which is vitally important. The lunchbox items are obviously a very good fit for TF2 and something that the game would objectively be way worse without. The new opportunities they open up for Heavy, the combination of self and team support, the fact that they basically single-handedly make Heavy playable as a class, their overall iconography and importance to the game's branding, it's hard to imagine TF2 without Heavy's lunchbox items. That said, let's dive into each of them individually. The sandwich was Heavy's first lunchbox items and definitely one of the big two. It boasts the highest raw numbers out of the three and is the most useful to a Heavy who's anchoring his team and playing around a medic. The 300 on-command health is incredibly useful for topping yourself off after a fight or between enemies, and being able to instantly grant any teammate who needs it the equivalent to a medium health pack is inarguably a massive benefit, especially for, or even in the lack of, a medic. Its only real problem is the 30-second recharge timer, which is definitely huge, and can lead to situations where you'll have to choose between your own survival and helping nearby teammates. All things said though, you really can't go wrong with the sandwich. It's the Smash Bros. Mario of lunchbox items, an all-arounder that's good in most situations. The Dilacus bar is Heavy's second lunchbox item and probably the weakest out of the three that heal. It only heals 100 health on a 10-second recharge timer, and the bonus of 50 extra max health kind of crumbles in the face of a medic due to its boost not stacking with and overall failing to an overheal. Plus, 50 extra max health won't really mean much outside of 1v1s with other heavies and sentries, and while it definitely can be a linchpin that decides your victory, the situations where it flawlessly lines up and saves your entire team will likely be few and far between. This is an item that flourishes best on a solo Heavy going into a big battle, but isn't too worth considering aside from that. I know some people swear by it, but I'll give it a generous not for me. And Heavy's last healing lunchbox item and the other side of the big two is the second banana, also known by the much better name of the battle banana. This was introduced in the game as a joke consolation prize for Heavy losing the meat versus match contest, which is funny because it's better than every weapon that Pyro got out of winning that contest. This is basically Sandwich Light and operates as a great support tool for a solo flanking Heavy. It heals 200 health with a 10-second recharge, and due to the recharge timer starting during the eating animation, the actual time between bananas is closer to 5 seconds. This allows it to handily out-heal a sandwich in terms of prolonged healing over time, and is a no-brainer for a Heavy operating without a medic. As a trade-off, its in-the-moment healing is lower, and it's significantly worse for a team play-oriented Heavy, as the noticeably worse burst healing it provides to teammates and especially medics makes it less viable for team support overall. It's definitely still strong, but also a bit selfish compared to the sandwich. All of these food items have unique concrete niches within Heavy's kit, with the sandwich being best for a team player anchor Heavy, the Dilacus bar being the best for a solo anchor Heavy, and the battle banana being the best for a solo flanking Heavy. They cover each other's weaknesses in such concrete ways, and encourage switching to and from them so consistently that it's hard to pick just one. These are all around some of my favorite weapons in the game, and are a big part of why Heavy is my favorite class. They're such brilliantly, thoughtfully designed weapons, and ones that are as core to my perception of TF2 as rocket jumps, mediguns, and the color orange. I cannot imagine this game without them. They are key staple TF2 items, and should be some of the first things you consider when thinking about the game. They turn Heavy into a viable class, they're funny as hell, and they're delicious. What's not to like? Get the hell out of here, Buffalo Steak. So where does that leave us on TF2's self-healing weapons? Well, I have two observations to make about them. One is that with exception to the Mad Milk and the Sandwich, these tend to be very contentious. Players generally don't like it when they shoot at enemies and they don't die in the amount of shots or damage that they perceive they should. If they have a medic following them, then there is a clear and concentrated reason why that's happening, and a target for them to focus on. They need to shoot the medic. However, in the case of something like the Black Box, the half-zatoichi, or the kunai, a player might not immediately realize or care that the enemy they're fighting is using a weapon that heals them, and will just get frustrated that they're not dying. Personally, I think this speaks to a larger perception problem and people not being willing to counterplay around certain weapons, but it is worth noting that some of these weapons are not very well liked. Aside from that, something else I noticed is that, once again, with exception to the Mad Milk and the Sandwich, most of these weapons don't tend to compensate or make up for the lack of a medic on a team. Be it for the Black Box's lackluster healing and overall lower damage, the half-zatoichi taking away the demo man's primary and secondary weapon and just being not that worth using on soldier, and the kunai starting you out at a significantly worse base, these weapons really do flourish the best alongside a medic, rather than as a replacement or substitution for one. Medic is the most important class in TF2, and no matter how much you want to deny it or how much you want to try to replace him with fancy toys or peripherals, you just won't be able to do without that medic companionship. Regardless, thanks, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! The Team Fortress 2 community is not one that tends to agree on much within itself. Between the balance and viability of certain weapons, the balance and viability of certain classes, and in some cases, the sheer existence of certain cosmetics, TF2 fans are generally infamous for being willing to kill each other in the streets over whether or not trash or garbage is better. The TF2 community is, at the very least, extremely passionate about the game, for better or worse. However, even with that, there are a few generalized sentiments you'll hear most of the community join hands on. Medic is the best class in the game. Cheaters and bots need to go. And for the purposes of this video, some weapons are really annoying. There are quite a few TF2 weapons that cross the line into being problematic by the community standards, but in this video, I wanted to discuss 3 that I feel are the uncontested most hated weapons in the game. Weapons that may be fun to use, yet elicit nothing but sheer blood-boiling rage from the people fighting them. While these weapons might not be overpowered or even the best in slot picks for their respective classes, you'd be hard-pressed to find a TF2 player who has charitable things to say about fighting them. Please note that it's impossible for me to cover every base in this video. I'm sure there are weapons that you hate that aren't included, and feel free to share them. I'm just discussing the 3 that I see come up negatively in conversation the most. That said, let's roll.
Get out of here! Get out of here! Protective shield! Protective shield! Protective shield!
Let's start out with a long overdue class for the Weapons Subcategory series. I've made it no secret in the past that I am not a medic main. In fact, he's my least played class by some margin, and because of that, there's always been one particular medic weapon that struck me as a bit intimidating. A weapon that's widely recognized as one of the most maligned weapons in the game to fight against, yet at the same time has several dedicated medic players swear by it every day. The protective shield generator, the vaccinator. The vaccinator is such a black and white weapon within TF2. If you're the medic using it, or if it's on your team, you'll probably love it and take no umbrage with its unique brand of utility and in-the-moment decision-making. However, if you're fighting against the vaccinator, you'll often find yourself experiencing some of the most frustrating, lopsided, negativity bias-inducing interactions possible in the game. Because while players generally respect the medic's abilities and view them as a necessary and healthy part of TF2's gameplay loop, nobody would really call what the vaccinator does healthy. But why is that? Well, the Vaccinator is an unlockable medigun for the medic. At a base, it builds Ubercharge 67% faster when healing non-overhealed targets, yet 33% slower for overhealed ones, and features a 66% slower overheal build rate. These stats are all on top of the universal, complicated math-filled medigun Uber and overheal scaling that I'm not enough of a medic main to confidently recite. As a primary set of mechanics, however, the Vaccinator boasts 2 very unique traits. It features a unique segmented Uber meter, with the player being capable of popping at any increment of 25%. This allows very frequent and liberal use of this medigun's Ubercharge, which is handy because its Ubercharge is really fucking annoying. Healing a target with the Vaccinator grants the medic and his heal target a constant 10% resistance to either bullet, explosive, or fire damage on top of healing, and this resistance is buffed to a whopping 75% and full crit resistance during its Ubercharge. The medic can freely cycle between resists at the click of the reload button with no cooldown, which when combined with this weapon's fast and disposable Uber, make it an incredibly dynamic and flexible medigun for dealing with multiple damage sources. So that all sounds well and good. In theory, this weapon should function as a fast, more dynamic, yet less impactful version of the stock medigun, with it bolstering the medic and his heal target's resistance to a specific type of damage at readily accessible intervals, rather than requiring a lengthy and committal charge time for full damage immunity. But that's all
in theory. In theory, communism works. In theory.
Because you see, in practice, this weapon functions less as a poor man's defensive buff or in-the-moment utility, and more as a dedicated screw you button for whatever ails you and your heal target. The amount of things you're able to just give a proud, unapologetic middle finger to using this weapon is simply absurd. The passive 10% damage resistance on top of otherwise uncompromised healing compared to stock would already be a little crazy, but it's the flexibility and leniency of this weapon's shields combined with its generous uber rate that really tips it into hated weapon territory. Because yeah, while it does require a fair amount of in-the-moment decision-making, adaptation, and prioritizing certain damage types, the Vaccinator is all around an incredibly lenient and forgiving weapon for what it offers. When you start using this weapon, you might think that it'll be really daunting and intimidating to decide on what resistances to use when, to decide on when to pop your 4 valuable uber chunks, etc., but in practice, the actual rate at which you should be using them is somewhere in the ballpark of at every goddamn opportunity. ABP is the mindset of the Vaccinator. Always be popping. With smart play and prioritizing the right heal targets, you can pretty much always have a shield up. Not only does switching between the Vaccinator shields have no cooldown, allowing you to theoretically stack multiple shields on one person with fast enough switches, not only are you still able to capture objectives while using them, a unique trait amongst Ubers, not only are you able to use Ubers within seconds or moments of each other, with them recharging in a matter of seconds, but you also fucking regain Uber while using it. If you exercise even the slightest bit of opportunistic play, you will likely never be without a shield in the throes of the average Vaccinator match. This is one of the more contentious things about the Vaccinator. While sustained focus fire from multiple damage sources can absolutely outnumber its healing, it is guaranteed to always remove the agency of one specific player that is fighting against it. Whatever the medic using it views as the highest priority target to shield against basically gets a dedicated stop sign thrust into their face. It does have counterplay, but when 1/3 of your team's damage will be useless against it, it's not very fun to play against. But, you know, it only covers bullet, explosive, and fire damage, and TF2 does have more damage types. Melee weapons are completely unaffected, which can make Demo Knight a good counter to it, and things like the, Flying Guillotine and the Enforcer pass through its resistances, really busting out the Moon Knights and Daredevils of TF2 weapons for this Galactus. The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of dedicated damage-dealing weapons in TF2 will be countered by the Vaccinator, and even though the medic can only block one type of damage at a time, he's more than capable of rapidly switching between them with no consequence. I honestly feel as though this is the root of the Vaccinator's problems. A weapon with a disposable incremental Uber is fine, and a weapon that casts damage shields is also fine, but the problem with the Vaccinator is that it's too generous and lenient in giving these bonuses, granting the medic and his heal target too much sustainability and answers to common situations without the risk or commitment asked by other mediguns. I honestly feel as though all it really needs is a cooldown or healing debuff between switching resistances, or maybe slightly worse healing at a base to compensate for the utility of a constant 10% damage shield. I know it has a slower overheal build rate, but maybe a slightly slower heal rate on top of that would suffice. And to be completely fair, the Vaccinator does have a few concrete weaknesses. It does not mitigate knockback, including the amplified knockback of crits, so you can still bounce around an Ubered pair as easily as ever, and the resistances that the medic and his heal target are currently rocking are prominently displayed at all times above their heads. This means that, with coordinated enough play, you can bear down on them with enough focus fire from enough sources that the medic simply won't be able to block it all. A real Area 51 raid for the modern day. And that's ultimately the most frustrating thing about the Vaccinator. It's not an overpowered, over-centralizing, or overbearing weapon. There is concrete counterplay to it, and there are reasons that not every medic runs it. It's never a bad weapon to have on your team, but there are situations where the medic and his team may benefit more from another Uber. The Vaccinator is not broken. It's just superbly, astonishingly annoying and lopsided to fight against. Fighting a Vaccinator and his heal target can seem like an insurmountable uphill battle, with them having answers for seemingly everything you can throw at them and never running out of Uber chunks. Compared to other mediguns, which require a ton of inherent risk and commitment, the Vaccinator is a weapon that is disproportionately forgiving for the amount of utility it offers. The combination of fast-charging disposable Ubers, hefty fuck you buttons to every major damage type in the game, and the lack of required investment or commitment make this a fun and very satisfying weapon to use, yet a nightmare for your enemies. Back in my beginner's trap weapons video, I made the bold claim that the Brass Beast was my least favorite minigun to use on my personal favorite class, Heavy. This claim came bundled with a few unsavory implications, those being the insinuation that I enjoyed using the Holong Heater and natascha more than the Brass Beast. Now, I don't think anyone would say that the Holong Heater is a hated or controversial weapon, and I'd love to preach the good word of it in a future video, but the natascha, that one requires some explaining. To be frank, people really fucking hate the natascha.
I thought the two of you would like some nice, cool lemonade.
This man uses the natascha.
You don't get any lemonade.
Let's discuss why. The natascha is an unlockable minigun for Heavy and an achievement item at that. It boasts both a flat 25% damage penalty compared to stock and a 30% slower spin-up time, putting its spin-up duration somewhere between stock and the Brass Beast, without the colossal damage numbers of either to compensate. As a primary set of benefits, it boasts the same 20% damage resistance when spun up and below half health as the Brass Beast, and more importantly features a unique ability to slow enemies on hit. This is one of two weapons in the game that offers a guaranteed slowing or CC effect on enemies, and is the primary reason that people hate it. Now, the slow on hit effect is a bit misleading. This does not work like slowing or CC effects in something like Overwatch. It does not incrementally decrease the enemy's speed for any concrete duration. Rather, an enemy hit with one of the natascha's bullets will have their movement speed instantly drop to 113 hammer units, or slightly faster than a spun up Heavy, for the specific instant that they're shot, with the slow being reapplied with each individual bullet. This effect lasts for roughly the length of the stock hit sound, and through repeatedly landing close range bullets, you can effectively anchor an enemy in place so that they can't escape. The severity of the slow is not impacted by the enemy's base movement speed, so whether or not you're shooting a scout or a Heavy, the slow will be applied all the same. So it's more like a brief on-hit stun rather than an incremental slow. The slowing effect does feature some form of effect fall off, with it being less effective to borderline unnoticeable at longer ranges, but there doesn't seem to be any concrete documentation of the exact numbers available online, with even the TF2 wiki stating that it's unknown how much speed is lost over what specific distances. If you shoot an enemy close up, they'll be slowed. If you shoot them far away, they won't. Basically, like any other minigun, this weapon and its primary application are most effective at close range. And that's another thing with the natascha. Its damage penalty is pretty negligible at close range. Sure, at medium range, or in fights with other sustained damage sources like sentries or enemy heavies, you'll absolutely notice it, and it can lose you pushes that you would have assured victory with stock, but when fighting any other class, this thing is still very much a minigun, and does anywhere from 300 to 380 damage per second at close range. That, combined with its visual similarities to stock, and most players' default instinct being to get away from a revved up Heavy as they fight them, can result in frequent situations of enemies scrambling as they try to escape, only to find their feet dragging below them like they're on a treadmill. The natascha is a fairly uncommon weapon in casual, so most players are not immediately equipped to deal with it when it shows up. All of this combined makes the natascha a very frustrating weapon to fight against, being slowed to a crawl and basically having your death all but guaranteed for daring to stray too close to a class that's usually countered by close range evasive movement is pretty damn annoying. And the fact of the matter is that despite its hefty downsides, the slow effect virtually nullifies all of them. A slower spin up and less damage don't really matter when all it takes is one stray pellet to send your enemies down the snowball slope of a slow and unavoidable death. The natascha is a weapon that looks at Heavy's weaknesses, his slow movement speed and predictable tracking, and proudly says if you can't get up to their level, bring them down to yours. This is a weapon that puts every one of Heavy's natural hard counters except for Sniper at a severe and crippling disadvantage for daring to get caught by a few stray pellets. If you really hate scouts, strafe happy spies, rocket jumping soldiers, or damn, even poor demo knights, this weapon is for you. All of this leads to a weapon that I have seen be described as the dreaded C word, a crutch, padding and training wheels for Heavies who cannot track enemies without the slow. This is compounded by its nature as an easily obtained free achievement item. This is, all around, an Overwatch weapon in TF2. TF2 is not a game that's designed or well suited for mobility hampering CC. There are only two weapons in the game that do this, and the other one is the Sandman, a weapon that makes an already frail class even frailer and has its CC effect applied on a linear projectile playstyle with a lengthy cooldown. By comparison, the Natascha is a gun that applies its slowdown by using the primary fire of the highest sustained damage dealing weapon category in the game. It shouldn't be too hard to understand why people hate it. But wait, didn't I say I like this weapon? Okay, no. Like would be a very generous oversimplification of my thoughts on it. In general, I hate fighting against this weapon just as much as anyone else, and fully agree with the sentiment that its design simply does not work in TF2. Me placing it above the Brass Beast on my personal heavy weapon fun tier list is simply due to the fact that the act of using it aligns more with my personal heavy playstyle. I like being a mobile push-oriented team anchor rather than being a bait and punish oriented immovable object, and while this weapon does have more surface level similarities to the Brass Beast than stock, I'd say it's more flexible and all around able to be used in more situations than the Brass Beast. I still don't like it and genuinely think the game would be better off without weapons like this, but I like the act of using it more than the Brass Beast. Maybe, I don't know.
Surprise, bitch. I bet you thought you'd seen the last of me.
Boy, I sure do talk about Spy a lot in these videos. You'd think I liked anime with how much I talked about this guy. However, a running theme with my Spy discussions in most of these weapon subcategory videos have been that a lot of his weapons tend to be a bit controversial. Between the diamondback and especially the conniver's kunai, Spy has plenty of weapons that could have easily cracked their way into this video. However, I think that including them would do a huge disservice to one of the most playstyle facilitating, game flow altering, class defining unlocks in the game, the Dead Ringer. The Dead Ringer might seem a bit unassuming at first. It obviously doesn't secure kills itself and doesn't do damage, but make no mistake, this is probably the single most game flow altering weapon in TF2. This weapon single-handedly facilitates all of Spy's most controversial and hated combos. Every single time you fight a Spy in TF2, the possibility that he could have the Dead Ringer needs to be present in the back of your mind. It is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most playstyle altering singular item available to any class in the game. Let's talk about it. The Dead Ringer is an unlockable cloaking watch for Spy. Unlike his other watches, which are immediately activated upon pressing mouse 2, the Dead Ringer requires that the player first take damage with it held up, at which point the damage will be reduced by 75%, the Spy will be cloaked instantly and he'll drop a fake Spy corpse. For the next 3 seconds, the Spy can run around cloaked with a 65% resistance to all damage, an immunity to afterburn and bleed, and a speed boost. He'll also not flicker or shimmer when bumping into enemies for 3 seconds. After this 3-second period, he'll spend the last 4 seconds of his cloak under normal cloak rules. As for a few primary negatives, the Dead Ringer can't be activated manually, requiring damage for the cloak to go off. It cannot collect cloak from ammo boxes or dispensers at all, and it features a very loud and noticeable decloak sound effect. There's also this whole thing about it losing 50% cloak instantly upon activating it, but that's just a really roundabout way to explain that it has a 7-second cloak duration. So that was a pretty wordy stat lineup, and after hearing that, you might have some ideas in your head about what kind of watch the Dead Ringer is. Oh wow, you might be saying. This thing allows me to fake my death as Spy, and it shows fake kills in the kill feed, and it gives me a damage resistance. This must be the ultimate sneaky big brain cloaking watch. However, I invite you to throw all of those preconceived notions about the Dead Ringer straight into the trash, because this thing is not used to be sneaky or deceptive at all. Rather, this is the ultimate face tanking and damage sponging weapon in the game. The optimal play for the Dead Ringer is not to use it to deceive the enemy into thinking you've died to slip past them unnoticed. It is to walk completely conspicuously into the enemy team with it out, like a teenager taking a selfie in an active crime scene, and tank exactly 1 hit of damage so that you can slip behind the enemies with a massive damage resistance and afterburn immunity. The optimal play is also not to opportunistically use it to trick an enemy into thinking you've lost in a tight battle. It's to throw it up the moment you're caught out as a guaranteed get out of jail free card. So long as you have enough time and space to put sufficient distance between yourself and enemies, you will not be punished for any of this. Just face tank and run. The Dead Ringer is noteworthy as a weapon in TF2 due to most of its counterplay being to metagame. Checking things like if your kill count has gone up, if your strange weapon has gained a kill, if the Spy's name is grayed out on the scoreboard, things like that are the only surefire ways to tell if a Spy is dead ringing. A good rule of thumb is to always be quick tapping tab and looking at your kills anytime anytime you kill a spy. On top of that, there's no actual way to know if an enemy spy is actively attempting to bait a dead ringer. While you can tell based on whether or not a spy is actively shooting or attacking you, as he can't attack while holding his ringer up, he can easily just pull it out in between shots or predict when you're about to fire to throw off your game. You can never be too sure if a spy is truly dead if you've killed him while he's uncloaked without metagaming. The dead ringer is such an impactful weapon within TF2 because its sheer existence makes players have to readjust their entire strategy to fighting spy. Anytime you shoot an uncloaked spy and he dies, you have to check that scoreboard. You have to keep your guard up. The mere possibility that a spy may have this weapon completely changes the dynamics of the game. It allows spy to play in an incredibly aggressive forward manner and enables him to escape and skirt pretty much any guaranteed death scenario. This is the most that a single weapon changes the game by a fine margin. If you ever hear anyone complain about a spy weapon, say that it's overpowered or broken or annoying, rest assured they're complaining about it specifically alongside the dead ringer. The kunai grants spy insane survivability for getting stabs, but it gets tipped into being overpowered when he has a guaranteed out for failing. The diamondback gives the spy access to insane damage at any range, but gets even stronger when he can safely reposition himself at no cost. Any of these weapons are strong on their own, but not broken when they're operating under the assumption that the spy has to carefully slink around and pick his battles. When comboed with the dead ringer though, they really come into their own as infamous weapons. That is the fundamental issue with the dead ringer. It is not overpowered, but it changes the spy's fundamental rules so much that the rest of his kit and the game as a whole have to adjust to keep pace. The dead ringer is the tool that facilitates every noteworthy controversial spy loadout. Anytime you hear someone raging about a try-hard spy main on the enemy team, I guarantee you that they're rocking the dead ringer. Spy's controversial strongest weapons are balanced to work with spy, not with the dead ringer. The dead ringer is not overpowered, it's not broken, and it's not too strong. Its nature as a hated weapon stems entirely from it changing the base dynamics of the entire game. It's really not a healthy state for a single weapon to change your entire approach to fighting 1/9 of a game's playable roster. And while something like the gunslinger or wrangler might bolster engineers' offensive and defensive capabilities, the soda popper might grant scout unparalleled mobility, and the scorch shot might give pyro free range pestering, none of them completely change the game. None of them require taking yourself out of the game to counter them. None of them are the dead ringer. So those are what I believe to be the most consistently hated weapons in TF2. As for any observations I can make about them, it's that all three of them share a common theme. They strip away player agency. The vaccinator takes away the agency of specific classes to deal meaningful damage. The natascha takes away classes' agency to escape and maneuver evasively. And the dead ringer takes away an entire player's agency to know if there's a spy around. Weapons designed like this are frustrating to play against because they fundamentally take options away from the player. And unlike something like the stock Uber, they don't have enough associated risk for it to feel warranted. Overall, I understand the derision of these weapons, but I also understand that they are just guns in a 16-year-old game, so if you love them and want to use them, then more power to you. The police are on their way. Also, I'm sorry I sounded like I was dying for most of this video. I was sick when I recorded it, and you can't really call in sick when it comes to the algorithm and making content. Regardless, hope you enjoyed, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers. Christmas, or Smissmas as some might call it, is as core to Team Fortress 2's identity as the sandwich, mediguns, and rocket jumping. It might not seem like it these days, what with yearly Christmas updates, only adding a handful of new cosmetics and maps for the past few years, but historically, Christmas has been one of TF2's most fruitful and prolific times of year. Things like festive weapons, festivized weapons, tons of unique weapons, day group keep, manpower mode, some original lore-building comics, and more were all introduced as parts of yearly Christmas updates. Hell, the Mecha update and Tough Break update were both Christmas updates. So in this video, to honor TF2's Yuletide history and the holiday season being upon us once again, I want to discuss TF2's 3 Christmas weapons. And I don't mean festive weapons, I mean the 3 wholly unique TF2 weapons that are explicitly themed around the holiday season. Despite all being melee weapons, they all bring their own unique holiday edge to the average TF2 match, and I want to discuss them. All that said, let's roll.
My name is Eminem and I like to rap.
So, full disclosure, all 3 of the weapons we'll be discussing in this video are melee weapons, and 2 of them are for Scout specifically. Let's start out with arguably his most notable Yuletide killing tool, the Wrap Assassin. This is one of the funniest item concepts in the game, as I'm pretty sure we all have memories of using rolls of wrapping paper as a sword or bludgeoning tool in our imaginary quest to defeat our siblings in battle, so to see TF2 adeptly capitalize on that nostalgia is very cool. It's also, funnily enough, one of Scout's better melee weapons, and my preferred choice out of his entire melee lineup, regardless of the time of year. Let's discuss why. The Wrap Assassin is an unlockable melee weapon for Scout. It's a roll of Christmas wrapping paper and matching glass bauble, which can be swung at enemies for a massive 12 damage a hit. This gives it the second lowest per swing melee damage in the game, behind only the Fan of War, and unlike that weapon, does not bolster its own or team's attack damage with successive hits. Trying to secure kills with the Wrap Assassin's primary attack is, while certainly funny, oftentimes an exercise in futility that will result in your certain death. This is offset by this weapon's secondary attack, which, not unlike the Sandman, allows the Scout to bat a ball in his left hand at the enemy. Unlike the Sandman, though, this ball is actually a glass Christmas bauble, which will shatter on contact with an enemy, inflicting them with both impact damage, initial splash damage, and bleed for 5 seconds. This gives a direct hit bauble with the Wrap Assassin anywhere from a maximum of 59 to 79 damage. On top of that, the bauble recharges in only 7.5 seconds compared to the Sandman's 10, will deal a guaranteed critical hit after traveling for more than a second, and the splash of it colliding with a player or surface can deal additional chip damage to surrounding enemies. Boy, that was a lot of words for a cardboard tube and a glass ball. A good thing to remember about the Wrap Assassin is that it does everything you'd logically expect a roll of wrapping paper and a glass bauble to do when struck against someone. The roll does nothing and the bauble shatters. Now, you may be wondering why you would use something like this over the Flying Guillotine or Boston Basher, which are both other Scout weapons which grant bleed on hit. And I want to discuss that because I think there are legitimate arguments for it. As for the Boston Basher, the Wrap Assassin provides a less committal melee bleed alternative from a safer distance. While the Boston Basher can provide more bleed stacks and can be used to farm uber, the Wrap Assassin allows you to more safely apply bleed to enemies in singular bursts from a much more comfortable distance without needing to bomb in and risk life and limb to hit enemies. This weapon grants Scout a safe, surprisingly hefty medium range burst damage option that can reliably catch enemies off guard. Compare this to the Boston Basher, which requires running in with your melee weapon and potentially hitting yourself to apply its bleed. The Boston Basher is inarguably much better for team support and farming uber, but when speaking strictly about applying bleed to enemies, there is a legitimate case for the Wrap Assassin. As for the Flying Guillotine, that's a funny one because you actually don't need to choose the Wrap Assassin over it. In fact, the combo of both of them together has been affectionately dubbed the Bleed Scout and is a totally legitimate if gimmicky strategy. Just applying insane amounts of medium range burst and damage over time can be really fun and satisfying. However, if you're like me and really don't like using the cleaver over Scout's other options, then the Wrap Assassin provides a safe second alternative for a Scout who still wants to inflict bleed from a distance. I personally find the Wrap Assassin to be easier and more consistent to aim than the cleaver, and find Scout's melee slot to be a lot less competitive than its secondary one, but if you want to run both, you absolutely can. I personally think that that's really cool, that Scout has 3 bleed building weapons in his lineup, or over half of the bleed inflicting weapons in the entire game, and yet all of them have legitimate niches that don't step on each other too much. Things like this are what makes TF2 such a one-of-a-kind game in terms of its design. But aside from comparisons to other weapons, what does the Wrap Assassin provide on its own, and why is it my preferred Scout melee? Well, for one, this thing's mid-range burst damage combined with its damage over time is really good. I know it's technically more of a damage over time tool than a burst damage tool, but make no mistake, 19 to 39 damage on a target that's just a bit out of range of your scattergun can be exactly what you need to finish them off, and the bleed only adds on to that. The initial splash damage can tend to feel entirely random, but in situations where you land that perfect direct hit and chunk a light class for around a quarter of their HP, it can be really strong. Plus, the guaranteed crit after a certain distance can make this thing great for cleaning up fleeing low health enemies. That's not to say it's only useful as a fight ender though, as I find this weapon to be even more useful as an opener. In a 1v1, tossing the bauble at an enemy during the opening stages of a fight effectively puts them on borrowed time, with every bit of damage you do being punctuated by a guaranteed 40 bleed damage over time. This can be great for putting pressure on enemies during elongated 1v1s, or for allowing damage to build up, and is useful on pretty much any target. It significantly significantly shortens fights with light classes and softens up tankier classes significantly. Also, while I know we haven't talked about it much, please don't consider this weapon's lack of raw melee damage as some crippling or debilitating negative. In most cases, running up on enemies with your melee as Scout is not the optimal play, and he's easily one of the classes who can afford to sacrifice his melee damage in favor of utility the most. This weapon is, first and foremost, a projectile that inhabits the melee slot, and not a weak melee weapon. One last thing to note is the faster recharge rate, which, while still slower than the flying guillotine, does make this weapon noticeably lenient and non-committal. It's entirely possible to throw out multiple baubles in one fight thanks to the truncated cooldown, and makes you have to spend significantly less time considering when and how to use it compared to other recharging throwable weapons. All in all, the Rap Assassin is a surprisingly powerful Yuletide bleed bringer that can easily be the linchpin you need in fights, and also doesn't overlap too heavily with Scout's other bleed building weapons. I really like it between its surprising levels of utility and hilarious design, and there's nothing quite like beating an enemy down with its primary attack during the humiliation. If you tend to see this thing as more of a joke or throw weapon due to its concept and lack of direct melee damage, I'd strongly recommend re-evaluating it. Take it less as a melee weapon and more as a second mid-range secondary. You'll win every rat battle you find yourself in.
Ooh, piece of candy. Ooh, a 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 piece of candy.
On to our second holiday heavy hitter for Scout, we have an arguably much more forgettable weapon, yet one that I still like busting out every once in a while, the candy cane. This aptly named, oversized festive tree is one of the more often overlooked parts of Scout's melee lineup, yet one that I genuinely feel can be really helpful in the right circumstances. I'd like to note that a lot of the footage behind this section will not feature me directly using the candy cane in combat, as unlike most other weapons in the game, this one grants its positives and negatives passively to your entire loadout, rather than needing to actively use it in battle. But what are those positives and negatives? Let's dive in. The candy cane is an unlockable melee weapon for Scout. An oversized, literal candy cane with a Christmas bow, this weapon causes enemies killed by any of the Scout's weapons while it's equipped to pop out a guaranteed small health kit, yet makes the Scout take a flat 25% extra damage from all explosives, which puts him in one-shot range of demo pipes and soldier rockets comfortably. Boy, that was a short description. I need to pad out this section to make the SFM worth it. Say, if you see anyone comment that it's called Smissmas and not Christmas, despite Smissmas literally being one of the first words in the script, do me a favor and reply haha yeah in all lowercase. It'll be very funny. So you might see these stats and think that this item is immediately a direct upgrade to the stock bat. Guaranteed healing on every kill, and it's passive, and the only negative is a bigger weakness to a damage type that Scout is already adept at dodging, and in a lot of cases, you'd be right. The candy cane is absolutely helpful, and with a bit of careful navigation and knowing when to secure kills, the guaranteed health pack can give you just what you need to stay in the fight and tough out another kill. I find this weapon to combo exceptionally well with the Force of Nature, as being able to push enemies away can put distance between yourself and explosive classes, and can help you anchor your kills in such a position that makes it easier to capitalize on the health pack. They'll be in front of you in your forward path, rather than requiring you to loop back around and grab them. On top of that, the extra mobility granted by the Force of Nature can make avoiding explosives much easier, which is handy, because really, screw Demo Man when you're using this thing. I feel like a lot of people might see the increased explosive damage vulnerability and immediately think Soldier, but I found Demo Man to be a much more significant threat. Soldier has damage fall off and does less damage per shot at long range as a result, so I frequently found myself narrowly avoiding death after getting hit by rockets. Sure, the direct hit and beggars absolutely melt you, but that's pretty bog standard for Scout regardless of what weapons he's using. Demo Man, though, not only does he not have damage fall off, and not only does he have access to 2, or even 3, powerful explosive damage weapons, but if you've noticed, 25% of 100 is 25. The grenade launcher does 100 damage. Scout has 125 health. The candy cane makes the grenade launcher, iron bomber, and lock and load guaranteed one-shots on a direct hit pipe. This is the real weakness of the candy cane. Even with the healing, it causes damage against the Scout from several already potent sources to comfortably cross the one-shot threshold. Even if you do survive, you're often in a position where even landing the kill and getting the health pack will not bring you out of the one-shot range. Against a team with competent explosive classes who can consistently recognize and capitalize on your vulnerability, this weapon falls apart very quickly. And while the Scout is good at dodging explosives, all it takes is one well-aimed pipe or well-placed sticky to ruin your day. But to be fair, explosive classes only represent 2 of TF2's 9 roster slots. Against any class that doesn't specialize in explosives, this weapon is pretty damn useful, especially Spy. But especially Pyro. Pyro is one of Scout's natural kryptonites, as their close-range damage output and damage over time can really put a dent in Scout's otherwise comfortable flanking strategies. Being able to kill a Pyro and then be rewarded with an instant health pack, allowing you to extinguish yourself and heal off a bit of the afterburn, is really handy. It makes you less reliant on spending your Mad Milk to escape sure death at a Pyro's hands, and frees up your use of it for later. Or hell, maybe frees up your entire secondary slot if you really hate Pyros and rely entirely on Mad Milk. On top of that, this weapon is just great as a capper for long or tricky fights. If you narrowly survive a 1v1 and find yourself on death's door, the free healing you get for winning can really help bolster your survivability and put you back in the fight. You'd be surprised how much difference a small health pack's worth of health can make on Scout specifically in escaping or toughing out a battle. Or if you don't need it, let your team know there's a free small health pack and save somebody's life. Just make sure the enemy doesn't grab the health kit, which can absolutely happen. All in all, to quote the real Gyms, the candy cane is a weapon of sugar highs and sugar lows. The sugar highs of narrowly skirting death with your free health kit, healing up after a tricky battle, or helping out a teammate in need, contrasted against the sugar lows of being instant killed by explosive classes before you could even begin to react, and generally being made much squishier. It's an appealing weapon for sure, but one that's best enjoyed in moderation, lest you have too much sugar and...
It'll go right to your thighs.
My thighs?
And then you blow up.
You better watch out, 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 you better watch out!
And finally, let's talk about my uncontested favorite Christmas weapon in the game. Not only that, but my favorite heavy melee, and depending on what day you ask me, possibly my favorite melee weapon in the game, period. The Chris to my Kringle, the Santa to my Claus, the Egg to my Nog, the insurmountable, uber-interrupting Holiday Punch. Now, I realize that the Holiday Punch is not an often lauded weapon. It's pretty generally considered to be either a gimmicky novelty at best, or just not worth using compared to the Fists of Steel or Fast Gloves at worst. Me personally though, I have seen the light. I have been enriched to the ways of the Holiday Punch. Christmas juice courses through my veins at all times of year. Let's discuss why. The Holiday Punch is an unlockable melee weapon for Heavy. A set of adorable Christmas mittens, they deal the same damage and have the same rate of fire as the stock fists. As a primary set of mechanics, however, these gloves do not deal damage on critical hits or hits from the back, and instead force enemies into their laughing taunts upon hit. This effectively stuns enemies in place for the duration of the taunt, allowing for an easy taunt kill, damaging follow-up, or even an interrupted uber. On top of that, Heavies using the Holiday Punch will always make each other laugh, regardless of where the punch landed. So, a big mistake a lot of people make is treating the Holiday Punch like a gimmicky joke weapon. Like, this is something you see a TF2ber bust out in a silly loadouts video, try yourself for 10 minutes, and then go back to the Fists of Steel. They see the laughing effect as nothing more than a cute trolling tool that can sometimes lead to cheeky taunt kills. And I will tell you, this is a mistake. The Holiday Punch's laughing on crit or back hit effect is not a joke. Each class's laughing taunt tends to be some of their longest taunts, and once you're locked in, and at the mercy of the Heavy or his team. Rest assured, the Holiday Punch is less of a silly joke weapon and more of a goofily themed stun gun. You can comfortably interrupt some very impactful plays by just getting a lucky back punch or crit on an important enemy playmaker. I know most players' default instinct when landing a critical Holiday Punch is to taunt kill, but trust me when I say that that's far from your only option. Each class's laughing taunt leaves more than enough time for you to comfortably switch to your minigun, rev up, and kill them, or you can just keep on swinging. There is legitimate practicality to being able to stun an enemy on command. The misconception that this is purely a goofy joke weapon can be a costly one. I know what you might be thinking too. Well, why would I want to Holiday Punch someone when I can just shoot them with my minigun? Well, what if they're already in your face and you're not revved? Well, why would I want a crit that stuns enemies instead of outright killing them? Well, what about classes that won't die to a single crit, like soldiers or heavies? While it may seem a tad gimmicky, there are legitimate use cases where the Holiday Punch can absolutely save you and your team's ass, especially against uber charges. This is undeniably the strongest thing about the Holiday Punch. Aside from the Pyro's Air Blast, this may just be the strongest stock uber counter in the game. Considering that an enemy with an uber will likely be focusing a single target like a sentry, the issue of needing to catch them with a Holiday Punch becomes a lot less of an issue. TF2. From my experience, Ubered pairs don't actually tend to shoot holiday punch heavies, or at the very least view them as low priority targets, and often pay the price severely for it. My 2 big pieces of advice for this video: holiday punch heavies, punch Ubered pairs. They probably will not shoot you. And Ubered pairs, shoot holiday punch heavies. They are not joking or throwing. They're literally the only thing on the map capable of interrupting your push. They are not friendlies and should be your highest priority target. It takes exactly 1 lucky crit or back punch to completely no-sell your Uber. As for negatives, I really don't got much. Like, obviously this weapon falls apart on non-crit servers, and Heavy isn't great at chasing enemies to land back punches. He's certainly no spy, but these are more base mechanics of the game and Heavy problems, and less holiday punch problems. While it's not perfect in every situation, and you absolutely should not run at enemies fishing for holiday punch stuns, when it works, it really fucking works. This is a surprisingly effective weapon in the right hands, and while it may not have the universal utility of the Fists of Steel or the Fast Gloves, it most certainly has its niche, and it's very good in that niche. I've definitely had a time or two when I was behind an Ubered pair wishing I had the holiday punch. And that's ultimately why I love the holiday punch. It's a hypothetically goofy, silly throw joke weapon, yet in practice can be one of the most deceptively impactful weapons in the game. Nothing else can really no-sell an Uber like this. Nothing else can put an immediate stop to an enemy's game-winning carry in the way that the holiday punch can. Again, if you view this as nothing more than a silly joke novelty, give it an earnest whirl. I don't think you'll be disappointed if you use it in the right circumstances. It's not Metal Fist or Gloves of Speed, but it's guaranteed to put you in a laughing mood, whether you like it or not. And there we have it, a deepish dive into TF2's unique Christmas weapons. From delivering gifts onto your peers, to treating yourself to delicious snacks, to sharing a laugh with friends, these weapons deliver on holiday good times in every way. Unlike a lot of other weapon subcategory series videos, I walked away from this one feeling pretty positive towards every weapon in the video. The candy cane is easily the weakest, and even then, it's not bad by any stretch. I think all of these weapons do a great job incorporating some TF2 appropriate Christmas theming into both their designs and gameplay. These weapons warm our hearts and enrich our TF2 experience in the holiday season and every other time of year, and for that, I thank them. Happy holidays all, hope you enjoyed, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching. A Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you celebrate, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! In Team Fortress 2, primary weapons tend to be just that, weapons that act as their class's primary means of dealing damage. When the primary slot is generally relegated to stuff like shotguns, rocket launchers, miniguns, grenade launchers, and sniper rifles, it only makes sense that these weapons would be the most damaging ones in the game more often than not. Utility weapons, or weapons that focus on something other than doing damage, are usually relegated to the much more disposable secondary and melee slots. But not always. In some cases, a few brave TF2 classes may trade their primary sources of dealing damage in favor of facilitating plays with their other weapons. They may look at their primary weapons and boldly say, but what if? In this video, I want to discuss some of these utility primaries in TF2. Weapons within their respective classes' primary slots that focus on something other than dealing damage and securing kills. Are they good? Are they pointless? Only one way to find out. All that said, let's dive in. Out of the 3 classes we'll be discussing in this video, Pyro is easily the one who makes the most consistent use of their primary. They're the Pyro for a reason. Their primary job is to use a flamethrower to set enemies on fire. However, when the Pyro isn't running people over with their flamethrower and causing people to get mad at TF2 YouTubers for using the singular they, you'll often find them engaging in combo play. Pyro is arguably TF2's most noteworthy combo class, with things like the flare gun, extinguisher, and even panic attack enabling very potent loadout wide weapon combinations. Combo Pyro is a totally legitimate and viable playstyle, and one of the more skill-intensive things the class is capable of performing, and all of it is made possible by the degreaser. The degreaser, outside of having a name that elicits PTSD in anyone who's ever worked a food service job, is a very interesting weapon in TF2. It's designed purely and wholly to facilitate Pyro's multi-weapon puff and sting combos, and has been through a wide variety of very potent changes and nerfs throughout the years. It's a utility primary due to the fact that it takes Pyro's focus off of securing kills with their flamethrower and instead pivots entirely to using combos. But just how good is it at that? Is it worth using compared to Pyro's myriad of other primary flamethrowers? Let's dive in. The degreaser is an unlockable flamethrower for the Pyro. It's a makeshift, cobbled-together flamethrower constructed out of several common household items. At a base, it deals 66% less damage through afterburn than Pyro's other primaries, dealing only 1 damage per tick rather than the stock flamethrower's 4, and costs 25% more ammo to air blast with, taking 25 ammo compared to stock's 20. As a primary set of positives though, the degreaser both holsters and readies faster than Pyro's other primary weapons on switch, with it deploying 60% faster and holstering 30% faster. This makes it less ideal for face-to-face fighting and securing afterburn kills than stock, but makes it much stronger as a combo tool. Right off the bat, we have something important to note here. The holster speed bonus is actually bugged. Due to a universal issue across all of TF2's weapons, any stat that positively or negatively affects a weapon's holster speed will only be applied after roughly a second after the weapon's been deployed, so you won't notice if you're rapidly switching between weapons. This might theoretically make the degreaser seem a bit pointless, however, thanks to its significantly faster deploy speed, the time loss on being required to have it out for half a second is somewhat mitigated. Aside from that, this weapon's intended use case should be very clear. It's explicitly designed to be used with combo Pyro, and is pretty much a necessity to anyone who intends to play the subclass seriously. If you're clicking on Pyro with the intention of frequently switching weapons, flare punching, and extinguishing, you are throwing away significant time save potential by not equipping the degreaser. Pyro as a class is the most adeptly designed in the game when it comes to combining all of their weapon slots, and the degreaser is a weapon that greatly facilitates this. The general order of operations is to ignite, air blast, switch, flare punch, switch, extinguish. The combination of extinguish into flare gun, a weapon that guarantees 90 damage crits on burning enemies, can lead to an inescapable instant 100 plus damage chunk right out of the gate for your enemies, and if they survive that, then either a quick swing with your extinguisher, or switching back to the degreaser and lighting them up like Fry's old Chevy Nova should be enough to do the job. This combo grants Pyro, who's usually one of the game's most linear and predictable sustained damaging classes, access to a devastating burst damage option that can blindside most enemies. It's especially damning on light classes, who probably won't be able to survive past the initial flare punch. That's not to say that it's only useful with the flare gun though, as this weapon also combos exceptionally well with Pyro's shotgun. The panic attack is my preferred choice, and it's really fun to be able to ignite an enemy and then start hammering them with shotgun blasts before they can react. Being able to land 2 or 3 shotgun shots on an enemy before they're even able to readjust after an air blast is really satisfying, and is a playstyle that I honestly might prefer to the flare punch failsafe. It's a different breed of combo Pyro, but one that certainly has its merit. All of this devastating combo potential and burst damage is definitely really helpful too, because in general, this weapon is not great for sustained damage. While its raw fire damage is completely uncompromised compared to stock, its significantly weakened afterburn damage can be really troublesome. Not only does it make it virtually impossible to secure kills on fleeing enemies or posthumous kills, as 1 damage per tick isn't too difficult to tough out outside of very close fights, and not only does it make afterburn completely useless on medics and conch soldiers due to their constantly refilling health, but it also noticeably weakens your sustain. When you're holding mouse 1 into an enemy on Pyro, you're not just dealing direct fire damage, you're also dealing constant afterburn damage underneath that. The two of these combined tend to stack up on top of each other, and are the reason that enemies melt so quickly when confronted with a W plus M1 Pyro. The double whammy of rapid direct damage and creeping passive damage over time really adds up, and does make a significant difference when it comes to the amount of time it takes to kill enemies. The degreaser significantly worsens the damage over time aspect of this duality, and means that you're really only dealing meaningful damage with your sustained primary fire. This is why the degreaser can tend to feel so much weaker than stock, even if there's no listed direct damage penalty. On top of that, the degreaser does feature an air blast penalty, and while it's not terribly damning in the moment, it does amount to 2 less air blast over an entire tank of ammo if you've never used your primary fire, and that can absolutely sneak up on you if you're fighting especially daring projectile classes. This is funny too, because I feel like a lot of people tend to view the degreaser as the air blast flamethrower, when in reality, all of Pyro's non-stock flamethrowers have an air blast penalty. Maybe there's an unfulfilled niche for an air blast focused flamethrower, I don't know. Regardless, if you're fiercely married to the degreaser and tend to air blast a lot, this is something to keep in mind. All of this combined results in the degreaser being a flamethrower that's intended use case should be entirely clear. It is a purely combo-oriented support primary, and not one that you're intended to bomb in on enemies with expecting to W+M1 sweep an entire team. I honestly really like that a weapon like this exists, as combo pyro is kind of a community-defined subclass and not something that's explicitly baked into the class's design, so for Valve to add a weapon that directly supports it is really cool. It's like the family business to Fat Scout, except actually good and worth using. No, I will not be elaborating. I'd recommend combo pyro. It's really fun, and if you're gonna play it, you're best off bringing the degreaser. It's not a damaging powerhouse, but it'll certainly clean up the enemy team in its own greasy way.
If the show's called Invincible, then why can I see it?
Our next two classes are more interesting for this video, as they're both ones who do most of their damage with things other than their primaries. They feature more specialized combat roles that don't require active use of their keyboard's one key with any degree of frequency, and as a result can make it by just fine with a dedicated utility primary. Our first of these two classes is the perennial favorite of the Weapons Subcategory series, the Spy. Would you believe I've talked about him in all but 2 of these videos, and one of them was an accident?
I keep having this nagging feeling that I've forgotten something.
Hey, if you forgot it, it probably wasn't all that important.
Yeah, I guess.
For real, in this installment, we'll be discussing one of his more widely respected weapons, and my personal favorite of his revolvers, the invisibility-enabling L'Étrange.
この世には断りのつながりがある。この私を追撃する行為は必ず災いの痛手となってそのものに帰っていく。Wonder of You.
The L'Étrange is really unique as a spy weapon, as it's the only one he has that actively and passively buffs what's inarguably his most important and class-defining ability. Disguises are definitely cool, and I've been recommended enough video essays about them to know that they're useful, but the TF2 community at large has also more than effectively figured out how to spy check, and in casual specifically, they're more of an occasionally useful fallback than a 100% essential class-making necessity. No, Spy's real most important tool is his Cloak. It's the thing that allows him to get behind the enemy, sneak in undetected, and not be immediately shot and killed on sight, and the L'Étrange knows that. Let's discuss it. Also, I know it's technically a secondary in the game's files, but who really cares? The L'Étrange is an unlockable revolver for the Spy. It features a flat 20% damage penalty compared to stock, giving it a maximum ramp-up damage of 48, making it pretty much entirely unusable for dedicated gun spy play or direct combat as a whole. This seemingly crushing negative, however, is handily outmatched by some of the best positive stats a spy weapon could possibly have. The gun restores 15% of the Spy's Cloak on hit, allowing you to recover a whopping 90% with a whole clip, and more importantly, it passively buffs the Spy's Cloak duration by a gargantuan 40%. This gives the default Inviswatch a cloak duration of 14 seconds, the Cloak and Dagger 9 seconds, and the Dead Ringer a modified 8 seconds. This comfortably augments the Spy's basic infiltration, and is a boost you can always do with. So, I mentioned in my Beginner's Trap weapons video that raw damage numbers are not everything in TF2, and that there were weapons with damage penalties that were still very good. This video is obviously all about them. However, the L'Étrange specifically is noteworthy in this regard because it's probably the best one of these in the entire game. Spy is not a class who specializes in frontline gunfighting. While Gun Spy is very fun, Spy's most notable combat utility is his backstab, and anytime the average Spy player will be using their gun, it'll be to clean up low health targets or as a fallback after a missed stab. Spy can comfortably afford to go without his revolver damage, and the L'Étrange gives him some very strong boosts for it. For starters, the 15% additional Cloak on hit is a sleeper underrated stat. If you ever find yourself caught out without your Cloak in a battle that you know you can't win, landing a few cheeky pot shots and getting out of there is a more than valid strategy for assuring your survival. It makes pecking hit and run plays totally viable even with the L'Étrange's lower damage. You can be a really persistent pest to the enemy team and virtually never run out of Cloak. And even then, it's still totally possible to secure kills with this weapon. If you're behind enemy lines and see a fleeing low health enemy, it's super easy to clean them up and then recloak like nothing happened. Spy can see enemy health, which goes well with a gun that allows you to comfortably infiltrate enemy lines. The main draw of this weapon, however, is its passive 40% extra Cloak. This is absolutely gargantuan and on some gunboats level shit in terms of buffing one stat enough to make the entire class significantly stronger. stronger. Like I said earlier, the spy's cloak is his most important non-backstab ability. Without it, he'd be relying on brute forcing his way through enemies with disguises to infiltrate enemy lines. Giving him an additional several seconds of cloak opens up so many new avenues for an evasive and sneaky spy. You're significantly less reliant on positioning and ammo packs. You're given much more wiggle room in terms of when and where you decloak. You're able to perform recon for much longer and more comfortably, and more importantly, you're able to escape much easier. With the Lestrange, the cloak and dagger becomes pretty much obsolete. You do not need any help staying cloaked forever with this gun. The extra cloak allotment makes it entirely possible to bridge the gap between multiple ammo packs without ever needing to decloak, and if you do a quick once-over of the battlefield, you should never have trouble finding a way to stay topped off. On top of that, your overall pathing through a map is made significantly more lenient. You don't need to strictly adhere to a rigid course through a battlefield, and have time to adjust your path on the fly if need be. You have a lot of much more comfortable wiggle room to find a safe route and a safe place to decloak. On top of that, escaping with the Lestrange is an absolute breeze. You know that classic spy play of slinking in, backstabbing, and slinking out so quickly that the person you just stabbed only sees a cloak on their kill cam? Yeah, that's super easy with this gun. You can be an absolute menace to the enemy team, just endlessly hanging around while cloaked, and taking careful attacks of opportunity while they scramble to find the imposter among them. And what's crazy is that it's all passive. You don't need to have the Lestrange as your active weapon or use it in battle to take advantage of this bonus, meaning that proactively using cloak in and out of stabs is totally viable. As for negatives, the only real issue is the lack of raw bullet damage, which can definitely be a bit problematic in situations where you can't safely run around with your cloak, like on Payload Last for example, but in general, Spy doesn't need his raw revolver damage to do his job, and if you're even equipping this gun, you're likely more than comfortable with not playing Gun Spy. Again, this gun is pretty much Spy's equivalent to the gunboats, a single utility that sacrifices in-slot damage to make the entire class stronger and more flexible. The only reason you don't see every Spy player running this is because the revolver slot is very competitive, and each option facilitates an entirely different playstyle. But if you're a spy who likes to run around at the stock Inviswatch, likes to infiltrate and perform recon, likes taking attacks of opportunity, and all around likes playing spy the way he's intended to be played, you can't go wrong with the Lestrange. It's the shining example of why raw damage numbers are not everything in TF2, and one of my personal favorite weapons in the game. It doesn't have the insane snowball potential of the Diamondback, the burst damage potential of the Ambassador, or the consistent safety of stock, but it has enough going on aside from that to make it more than worth equipping. This weapon's strength certainly should not be invisible. And lastly, we've got the Engineer. Just like Spy, he's a class of the more specialized role who focuses on dealing damage with something other than his primary weapon. In this case, it's his epic and iconic sentry gun. Engineer is noteworthy for having two secondary weapons instead of a dedicated primary, with both his default shotgun and pistol being weapons that occupy other classes' secondary slots. This should make it clear that Engineer is not designed to be a frontline gunfighter, and rather a supportive multitasker whose job it is to facilitate the entire rest of the team's efforts from a comfortable distance. Whenever the Engineer is on the front lines, it's typically because his sentry has been destroyed and he has to take matters into his own hands. But that raises a question. What if the Engineer could maintain his comfortable distance while also helping his team? Well, that's where the Rescue Ranger comes in. The Rescue Ranger is such a cool weapon in TF2. So hypothetically strong, yet with enough downsides and counterplay to keep it from being entirely over-centralizing or broken. It's also one of the more complex and multi-layered unlocks within TF2, so you'll have to forgive me if the stat rundown on this one is a bit wordy. It's one of those TF2 weapons like the Huntsman or Flare Gun that's pretty much an entirely different weapon category that the game makes no effort to properly explain. That said, let's start with the stat rundown. The Rescue Ranger is an unlockable shotgun for Engineer. Rather than firing hit-scan bullets like other shotguns, this weapon fires projectile bolts that deal a maximum ramp-up damage of 60 to enemies. The low damage combined with the difficulty of tracking the projectiles makes this gun totally unsuitable as a dedicated combat tool, and on top of that, it features a 34% smaller clip size and a 50% smaller ammo reserve. It also marks the Engineer for death while he's holding buildings for good measure. As a few trade-offs to these hefty downsides, however, the Rescue Ranger's bolts heal the Engineer's buildings for 60 health with each shot, healing at a 4-to-1 metal ratio per shot, or at a more cost-effective rate than the swing from the Engineer's wrench. On top of that, the Engineer can instantly teleport any buildings he can see into his hands from any distance at a cost of 100 metal, allowing for quick and easy escapes in overwhelming situations. All of this makes the Rescue Ranger a defensive powerhouse that can facilitate very tanky buildings with enough metal budgeting, yet is totally unsuited for direct battle. Whew. Boy, that was a lot of words. If you gathered anything from that, it should have been that the Rescue Ranger is not a gun to bring for frontline gunfighting. This thing deals pitiful damage to enemies, its bolts are incredibly difficult and inconsistent to track and land your shots with, and it's all around not a good gun for straight up shooting other players. However, do not throw it in the trash just yet, as this is all by intentional design. Because you see, the Rescue Ranger is designed purely and wholly to be used in defensive scenarios with a level 3 sentry gun, and is very strong in that niche. The ideal situation with the Rescue Ranger is as follows. Have a sentry up in an impactful defensive position, have a dispenser up somewhere safe nearby, hunker down by the dispenser, and shoot the hell out of your sentry anytime it takes damage. The near infinite metal provided by the dispenser will allow you to theoretically budget your metal indefinitely and keep healing your sentry from range for as long as you need to. With proper setup and positioning, you can have sentries that look like this by the end of rounds, and there ain't no sentry busters in PvP, folks. On top of that, the Rescue Ranger's bolts heal at a more cost-effective rate than the wrench, allowing for very impactful healing at a less severe metal price. It's totally viable to shoot your sentry at close range rather than hitting it with your wrench, because you'll be saving more metal. Don't listen to that 4-to-1 healings red text. That's only there because this thing used to heal your sentries for free. This is an objective upside either way, and should always be treated as such. In addition, the range talling is a very useful, dare I say, underrated stat. In situations where your sentry is simply getting overwhelmed and you don't have the raw healing to outpace the damage, a quick right click can easily allow you to get out of there and regroup. It's better to mobilize and set up your sentry at the next point or in a different location than to let either it or you die trying in vain to save it with healing. Plus, the long range talling enables some crazy sentry jumping wrangler plays and some absolutely wacky sentry spots, so it's all around a sleeper helpful stat. Now, don't get my words confused. I'm not trying to say that the Rescue Ranger is an uncontested best in slot primary for a defensive engineer. It just almost is. Because you see, the bolts only heal your sentry. They only increase their health after taking damage. What the bolts do not do is reload your sentries, upgrade them, or most importantly, remove sappers. You will still very much need to be a proactive, on-the-move engineer with the Rescue Ranger, as all it takes is one coordinated push for a spy to place a sapper on your sentry that you can't reach to remove. The Rescue Ranger does require careful planning and especially positioning to use well. You have to set up your buildings in a very specific way to enable its best traits while also still helping your team. It is not an instant carry on equip type of weapon. And of course, I've said this a few times already, but this thing really blows for player versus player fighting. I feel like the in-game description doesn't do a great job articulating just how much of a non-combat weapon this thing is, and I feel like a lot of new players might get the wrong idea about it as a result. They don't even mention the damage penalty. Unlike the degreaser or Latrange, which both definitely do less damage but can still be used for combat, this gun is purely, transparently, and entirely designed to be used as a supportive tool for your buildings. Don't go around shooting people with it or you will die. But you know what won't die? Your sentry gun. And that's exactly what this weapon is designed to facilitate. Despite some of my commentary potentially seeming negative, I really like the Rescue Ranger in its niche. It's not an aggressive or offensive primary in any way, but the engineer has the Widowmaker and Frontier Justice for that. This is a purely defensive and supportive utility weapon that never makes any effort to convince you that it's anything else, and I absolutely respect that. It's not a weapon for every situation, and is very game state, map, and loadout dependent, but when it works, it really works. In the words of that soft-spoken, amiable Texan man himself,
sometimes you just need a little less gun.
And that was a look at some of TF2's utility primary weapons. Overall, I ended up feeling pretty positively towards all three of them by the end of this project. They're helped a lot by being weapons that require a good degree of careful thought and positioning to use efficiently, as any gun that deals less damage will intrinsically require more investment from the player to get the most out of. And with exception to Combo Pyro, I think you'd have a difficult time finding someone who has outwardly vitriolic or hateful things to say about any of these weapons. Oh, and if any of them are banned and competitive and actually super overpowered because of it, trust me when I say, I do not care. To me, these weapons are really interesting and represent what makes TF2 such an interesting game in terms of its design. Sometimes damage isn't everything, sometimes help is okay, and sometimes all you need is a little less gun. Thanks, hope you have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers! If I may make a broad opening statement for this video, Team Fortress 2 weapons tend to have stats. For real, the listed stats on the TF2 weapons tooltips are oftentimes the only indicator that a new player will have in determining what weapons are worth their time. While experience will ultimately breed a more thorough understanding of your own playstyle, when you've just picked up a new weapon, all you've really got to go on is the listed stat lineup. And that's kinda messed up because in general, TF2 does not do a good job of articulating just how important some stats are. For instance, if you were a fresh install new player with no concept of the soldier's game plan, would you think that a literal shotgun or boots that reduce self-damage would be more impactful? Or, for the purposes of this video, would you think that several weapons with perfectly fine stat lineups would be completely ruined by one singular line of red text? In this video, I want to discuss 4 weapons in TF2 that I feel are completely kneecapped by one singular stat, be it a core mechanic or a wayward addition as a part of a patch. Are these weapons salvageable despite these stats, or are they better left in the dustbin of TF2 history? All that said, let's roll.
I'm a classic man. You can be me when you look this clean. I'm a classic man.
Let's start out with just one of the weirdest goddamn weapons in TF2, the Classic. This thing needs no introduction. It's often considered one of TF2's most bizarre, outlandish weapon designs, and one that many players either strongly oppose or strongly support depending on how much they can tolerate its unique brand of gameplay. It also has a cult around it, which I'm not entirely privy to. That's one of the things that happened during my 2-year-long pandemic cleanse from TF2, just like Emesis Blue and the weapon reskins meme. But just why is the Classic such a divisive, fittingly cult classic weapon? Let's find out. The Classic is an unlockable primary weapon for the sniper. It's designed and modeled after the sniper rifle from Team Fortress Classic, as its name would imply. At a base, this weapon deals 10% less damage on body shot than stock, still dealing enough to kill light classes in one shot, but not medics. It can also not land headshots when not fully charged. As a trade-off, this weapon charges and zooms independently from one another, which is a stat that the game makes no effort to communicate the impact or importance of. Basically, holding M1 will charge your shot, decreasing your movement speed to the normal sniper zoom speed, and releasing M1 will fire. At any point, whether charging or not, you can zoom in at no cost to your movement speed. This makes this gun feel overall like a sort of blend between the sniper rifle and the huntsman, with it being equally usable at short, medium, and long range, at the cost of less damage and more committal headshots. So again, like I said, this is one of the weirdest weapons in TF2. What we've effectively got here is a sniper rifle with a huntsman firing mechanism. With the huntsman, you hold down and release M1 to charge your arrow and fire at the cost of decreased movement speed, and the Classic does exactly that with the perks of both being hit scan and having the ability to zoom. Unlike the huntsman, it can still comfortably drop light classes with a body shot, and due to being a sniper rifle, you don't have to worry about leading or tracking a projectile. This is just a weird little gun, and a design that I don't necessarily feel like anyone in the community was really thinking about or clamoring for prior to its release. Valve really answered a question nobody had with this weapon. Honestly, despite its reputation as a really bad or gimmicky weapon, the Classic is surprisingly fun in a casual environment and can comfortably allow you to secure kills that would have likely been out of your grasp with stock. Being able to survey the entire battlefield, peek and blast enemy snipers, instantly drop flanking light classes, and have full uncompromised views of your peripheral while still being able to gain and maintain a charge is unironically really novel and helpful, and being able to zoom and unzoom as needed without giving up that charge is really freeing. You really don't have to worry about constantly unzooming and surveying your immediate surroundings for flankers or encroaching enemies. I can comfortably say that I won a few engagements using the Classic that I would not have been able to with another sniper primary simply due to how flexible the independent charging and zoom are. On top of that, this weapon is really satisfying to use on a feedback level. Not unlike the Hitman's heatmaker, this weapon features a unique death effect for enemies, but whereas the Hitman's heatmaker pops enemies' heads, the Classic pops the enemy's enemy. Your opponents pop like grapes and you kill them with this thing, which, while definitely excessive, gratuitous, and lacking entirely in a gameplay purpose, is really damn satisfying and funny. Seeing an overconfident scout or spy attempt to rush you down, only to be popped like a water balloon, is unlike anything else in TF2. Honestly, if you can get adjusted to playing proactively and charging up preemptively as you approach fights, this weapon is kind of an uncontested king when it comes to dealing with flankers. While any sniper rifle can theoretically insta-drop a light class with a quick-scope headshot, not every sniper player will be able to consistently do this, and if any enemy overextends while you're holding a charge with the Classic, you basically have immediate access to an instant hit scan 135 damage shot that you just need to release M1 while looking at them to land. If you instead need to quickly zoom in and attempt a shot at a farther away target, you also have the option to do that freely. I've used these words a few times now, but I really can't stress how flexible and freeing the Classic feels when you get adjusted to pre-charging your shots before engagements. Now, this all sounds amazing, right? This is pretty much a hit-scan huntsman with more range, more damage, and the ability to zoom. However, you'll notice that this item is in the Weapons Ruined by 1 stat video, and that I've repeatedly mentioned the condition of when you have charge. That's because, despite the classic's flexibility in terms of its range, it's remarkably restrictive at the same time, in that you cannot land headshots when not fully charged. This is gargantuan, as it effectively mandates a full charge to secure kills on any full health target with no exception. Compare this to any other sniper primary, where you have the ability to quickscope and insta-pick any enemy with 150 or less HP. This is obviously a huge component of why Sniper is such a devastating and controversial class. He's able to secure incredibly impactful kills with very little time commitment or compromising his own safety. Even the Huntsman can land a fringe headshot from any level of charge. The Classic, by comparison, lacks that in-the-moment impact and is incredibly committal as a result. You need to pre-charge for every individual fight, or you'll be left caught out without meaningful damage. And when you realize that charging the Classic slows the Sniper to an agonizing moonwalk pace, this becomes a lot more problematic. You either need a fully charged headshot or body shot to kill anyone but a kunai spy at full health. You cannot fire off kill shots with this weapon without a 3-second time commitment beforehand, and there will be situations where you are not able to do that. This is definitely the weapon's most damning issue, and the reason it's in this video, but it's not the only one. For some reason that I'm not entirely privy to, you can't fire this weapon in the air, which means that drop-down shots, or shots after being knocked up by a soldier or air blasted, are impossible. Maybe this is a thing from TF Classic, I don't know. Also, as a more cosmetic negative, this weapon's laser sight is buggy as hell, and can become disjointed if you're moving your camera while charging, which can definitely throw off your aim if you're the kind of freakazoid who aims from your view model rather than your crosshair. That was me. I was that freakazoid until this past year. Lastly, the 10% body shot damage penalty is, while not as crushing as the Hitman's Heatmaker's 20, does come into focus more when you can't quickscope to mitigate it. Again, you need a full charge to kill anyone, no questions asked. All of these factors combined ultimately cause the Classic to be a somewhat disappointing weapon. Its incredibly wacky, non-conventional mechanics and generous range are offset by it being incredibly committal to land any meaningful damage, and by it requiring the player to adjust to its playstyle to make the most out of it. While I repeatedly praise this item's in-the-moment flexibility, there's an argument to be made that, in the long term, you're better off just learning how to quickscope. When you're caught out midway through a Classic charge, you're gonna stick out like a horseshoe crab in a freshwater environment. It's definitely very fun and a different type of sniper weapon, but one that's committal nature makes it more of a gimmick than a dedicated must-use. I guess you can beat the Classics after all.
Giving you your reward.
Your eternal reward.
So you guys know we've talked about all but 4, arguably 3, of Spy's unlockable weapons in this series. Why don't we just quickly knock out the rest of them so that we don't have to talk about this skinny French bastard anymore? Luckily for us, Spy has 2 weapons that fall into the Ruined by 1 stat category, and one of them is significantly more tragic than the other. Let's start out with the less contentious one, the ever-appealing yet always gimmicky Your Eternal Reward. The Your Eternal Reward is a really neat Spy weapon in TF2, as unlike the Classic, it single-handedly sets out to provide solutions for several of Spy's fundamental issues. Enemies being alerted to backstabs by sound cues, Spy needing to manually pick disguises for the right situations, Spy being given away by the kill feed and enemy ragdolls, etc. And despite the glowing lineup of uses, it's never a knife that anyone would say is Spy's best in slot option. Now, that's partially due to the kunai existing, but also because this weapon has a few really crippling negatives. Let's talk about it. The Your Eternal Reward is an unlockable knife for Spy. It's got one of the most conceptually cool concepts in the game, with it allowing the Spy to instantly take the place of anyone he backstabs. Basically, on backstab, the Spy immediately and seamlessly disguises as his target, with him never revealing himself between stabs, and the buffer period being so brief that not even mediguns have a chance to detach, nor sentries having a chance to target. On top of that, backstabs of this knife are almost completely silent, with enemy corpses instantly vanishing, the enemy not screaming, and Spy not saying any voice clips, with even the kill kill feed not displaying any activity. The only sound that the YER makes is the immediate impact of the stab, which is much subtler than the now absent normal sound cues. As if you trade off for this incredibly tantalizing lineup of stats, this weapon causes the spy to consume cloak 33% faster, and requires an entire full cloak meter to use a normal manual disguise outside of spawn. That was a pretty wordy stat rundown, but what you should have ascertained from it is that the Your Eternal reward is really fucking cool. When you use this knife properly, you've basically become a body snatcher, not just by killing and disguising his victims, but also by doing it instantly and unnoticeably taking their place. You'd be surprised how often enemies don't notice or react when their teammates literally start vanishing around them. The amount of times I've stabbed people while being healed by an enemy medic and he just turns a blind eye to it and continues healing me is simply criminal. This is inarguably an incredibly tantalizing knife, and through its core mechanics provides several answers to some of Spy's biggest roadblocks. On top of that, the silent killer mechanic is really helpful. Despite the intended design of Spy being that of an assassin who can chain stab an entire team, it's remarkably difficult in practice due to the very audible death screams and immediate kill feed notifications that come with securing a stab. By comparison, the Your Eternal reward gives enemies almost no indication that anything is amiss, with only context clues and the often inaudible stab sound effect being the only signs that an imposter's breached their defenses. Basically, if you ever wanted to roleplay as the monster from The Thing in TF2, this is the item for you.
Oh my god, he's so goddamn cool!
It so effortlessly answers some of Spy's most glaring issues, and I'm surprised that some of its core mechanics weren't baked into its design as a class and took this long to be added. Just like the classic from earlier, this may all sound extremely appealing, and just like the classic, it definitely is, but is also incredibly restrictive, because despite fixing some of Spy's basic fundamental problems, this weapon also simultaneously overcomplicates some of Spy's basic fundamental abilities, those being cloak and manual disguises. Despite the utility and immense fun factor of securing a cheeky stab and instantly taking someone's place, you've got to put forth a lot more effort to reach that stab than with any other knife. The requires a full cloak to manually disguise stat is absolutely crushing. While it might not seem like much as you're disguising with each backstab anyways, actually getting in to secure those stabs can be remarkably difficult when you can't adjust your disguise for each encounter. You basically have to make an educated guess as to who you should disguise as each time you're in spawn, as your only other option is to decloak on the battlefield and either wait for your cloak to recharge or pick up an ammo pack to be able to adjust on the fly. The tooltip does not lie. This weapon does indeed require and consume a full cloak when you manually disguise, meaning that you cannot disguise while cloaked. The game will tell you no if you attempt to without a full cloak meter. This significantly limits and restricts the spy's options and makes him entirely reliant on the knife's positive stats to get into position and maintain a disguise. And these positive stats can honestly be a bit of a curse in disguise. Not only does it take a simple spy me and voice chat to immediately sell you out, but if you happen to backstab, say, a freshly respawned heavy or faraway sniper, you're basically shit out of luck when it comes to securing any further stabs, as you can't comfortably close the distance on enemies without coming off as extremely suspicious. Your most valuable disguises, being scout, spy, and medic, are also the most difficult to secure, and your easiest disguises, like sniper and heavy, are some of your least useful. But oh, okay, why don't you just rely on your cloak instead? Well, because this knife, which already uses your cloak as a currency for your disguises, also cuts your cloak duration by 1/3. On any given day, I could change my mind on which stat really damns this weapon, because the 33% faster cloak drain rate is entirely unnecessary. While it's certainly easier to work around than the limited manual disguises, especially with the Latrange, it also adds another restriction and condition to what's otherwise one of Spy's basic mechanics. The fundamental issue with the Your Eternal reward is that it significantly handicaps all of Spy's class-defining infiltration, with the only tangible reward being the ability to disguise for free on backstab. Oh wow, how generous! I get to use one of my class's basic abilities, and all that it costed me was either 1/3 or all of my cloak. This weapon somehow makes you more reliant on your disguises and cloak than ever, while also simultaneously nerfing both. What the hell? This is the real problem with the Your Eternal reward. It's an incredibly, let me stress, incredibly incredibly fun and appealing concept, but it's significantly overbalanced as a result, and using it often amounts to nothing more than a fringe novelty until your enemy catches on. Remember everything I said about the Latrange granting Spy so much more freedom and wiggle room in the utility primaries video? Well, yeah, this thing does the exact opposite, for the positive trade-off of being able to use what's otherwise one of Spy's basic abilities. I think the Your Eternal Reward is a very tantalizing and fun weapon, and far from the worst weapon in this video, but whenever I use it, I ultimately end up wondering if the juice is really worth the squeeze. It's definitely eternally rewarding, but also eternally damning.
I wanted to do with a 3 and a 4. I wanted to do with a 3 and a 4. 3 headshots in a row. What do you know about that?
So the Your Eternal Reward is obviously not amazing, but it's also not a weapon that anyone would ever say was a meta or best in slot pick. It was always seen as a fringe novelty or gimmick and never a serious contender within Spy's lineup. Our next weapon, however, is quite the opposite, as it was considered Spy's objective best in slot revolver for several years. Then in 2017, Valve hit it with one of the most notorious nerfs in TF2 history. Let's talk about the Ambassador. Before we get into the stat lineup though, quick history lesson. From its release until 2017, the Ambassador was the spy weapon. It was the gun that any person intending to play the class seriously and with the intention of winning would carry, and was in the upper echelons of TF2's best in slot weapons. Then, in the coveted Jungle Inferno update, Valve did the unthinkable and significantly nerfed it. This was, in the words of a much better YouTuber than me, basically every spy player September 11th. It was an inarguable nerf to one of the game's top tier meta weapons, and a gigantic shakeup to the game's overall weapon meta. This would be like if Valve decided to nerf the Tomislav or Crusader's crossbow. It threw a huge dent into the spy meta that I'm unsure if the community has ever fully recovered from. But that ultimately begs the question, what was the nerf and was it warranted? Let's dive in. The Ambassador is an unlockable revolver for spy, an intricately designed, engraved piece that was clearly a labor of love for someone at Valve. Its only positive stat is the ability to fire off headshots, dealing a maximum of 102 damage per headshot. This is the only non-sniper weapon in the game capable of doing this. It's also this weapon's one and only positive, with its negatives being a flat 15% damage penalty, a 20% slower firing speed, an unlisted mechanic where its accuracy is worsened and headshot ability taken away for about a second after each shot, and its critical hits being affected by damage fall off, which was the stat added in the controversial Jungle Inferno nerf. This gives its critical hits a damage of only 58 beyond close range, or not even enough to two-shot a light class or one-shot a kunai spy. To say that the addition of damage fall off on this gun's crits was absolutely weapon killing is a serious understatement. It might not seem like much considering that this weapon still outputs huge damage once every few seconds at close range, but make no mistake, the niche of sniper spy and being able to instantly chunk or pick off distant enemies comboed exceptionally well with Spy's basic infiltration and ability to see enemy health, and was inarguably what made it such a strong choice. To this end, I can fleetingly understand Valve's reason for this weapon's nerf. Spy is already a class capable of instantly killing anyone in the game, so giving him immediate access to a weakened version of the game's other dedicated instant kill mechanic is definitely a choice. The hyper-aggressive gun spy playstyle this thing enabled probably didn't align with Valve's vision for Spy as a class, so weakening it makes some degree of sense. I mean, wouldn't it be crazy if Spy could fire off an unlimited amount of cross-map hit scan 120 damage critical sniper rounds? Fuck. Yeah, for some incredibly baffling reason, Valve saw it fit to heavily nerf the Ambassador, but leave the diamondback completely as is. The Ambassador now, on top of its slower firing speed, buffer period between shots, and damage penalty, did pitiful damage with a headshot beyond close range, completely mitigating its intended use as a potent high execution damage dealer. This resulted in the Ambassador being very bad. Look, I'm sorry guys, I know this thing still has its fans and truthers, but from my experience, its hefty downsides and lack of damage beyond close range really leave it in kind of a lackluster position. It features an incredibly skill-intensive single positive and 4 crushing downsides, but that positive isn't strong enough anymore to make up for it. Unlike every other weapon on this list, which had their negatives baked into their core designs and concepts, the Ambassador truly was a strong, if skill-dependent weapon that was tipped into bad weapon territory by a concentrated nerf. It was already a weapon with a ton of downsides, but the addition of a condition to its only positive is what really ruined it. It's absolutely still usable, its close range burst damage is still insane, but it lacks the flexibility and devastating long range damage it used to have, and the diamondback still has. It also doesn't have the consistent reliability of stock or the utility of the Lestrange. It's just kind of an incredibly overbalanced close range burst damage option that fails to consistently outperform its alternatives. To its complete credit though, it does feel really good to land a close range headshot, and the rare occasion that you're able to time your shots and double tap a light class for 204 damage is really fun. It's also got an incredibly sleek and detailed design. This thing was clearly a favorite amongst someone at Valve during its creation, but the fact of the matter is that all this gun does is output big numbers at close range with incredibly precise aim, which the diamondback does from any range with any level of aim. The level of effort and skill required to output big damage with the ambassador is simply not worth the result. This is all around a weapon that, by all accounts, was left in the dust as the game progressed around it. This is all around an incredibly tragic story. While I do understand that the ambassador was a controversial weapon and that it did enable some very unintended spy playstyles, the sheer level of disrespect Valve threw its way is unlike most other weapons in the game. Even the righteous bison they attempted to buff. The ambassador really was in a mostly fine place prior to the addition of damage fall off, and I feel as though with a more lenient per shot negative, maybe only the first shot of each clip being a potential headshot or something like that, it'd be in a much better place. But more so than any other weapon on this list, this truly is a weapon that was ruined by one stat. It looks so cool too.
The Brotherhood sure knows how to take someone out with style. Institute ain't got much hope against Liberty Prime.
And for our last weapon in this video, let's talk about one I've already discussed in detail on this channel before, the Liberty Launcher. Now, I was originally going to pass over it for this video since I did already talk about it in detail in my Beginner's Trap Weapons video, and because I got this very ominous comment warning me not to talk about it, so if I end up dead in the next few days, at least you know who to blame. But nah, I wanted to revisit the Liberty Launcher both due to my initial discussion of it being mostly through the filter of a new player's experience with it rather than a general weapon discussion, and because I got some very valid feedback about my thoughts toward it in that video. Full disclosure, I do not at all think that the Liberty Launcher is a bad weapon. It's arguably one of the worst rocket launchers, but the worst rocket launcher is still better than the best like SMG or Pyro Melee. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the Liberty Launcher is the best weapon we're discussing in this video. It comfortably augments soldiers' movement, it's incredibly active and flexible, and it just feels really fun to use. And yet, it's still one of Soldier's weakest primaries, and it's entirely and squarely due to its one sole negative. I don't think you can really call something like that anything other than a weapon ruined by one stat, even if it is still fun. But just what is that negative, and why is it so crushing? Let's discuss. The Liberty Launcher is an unlockable rocket launcher for Soldier. It features a huge lineup of positive stats that all act as some of the objective best that a Soldier player could ask for. Its rockets travel 40% faster than stock, or half as fast as the direct hit. It loads one additional rocket in its clip, allowing for 5 shots before needing to reload, and its rockets deal 25% less self-damage to the Soldier. As a trade-off, this weapon also deals 25% less damage to enemies, giving it the lowest per rocket base damage out of all of Soldier's rocket launchers, with a base damage of 68 per hit, or slightly more than a melee swing. Right off the bat, it should be entirely obvious that this thing is not intended to be a hard carry rocket launcher for a solo soldier. Everything that it does makes Soldier more dynamic and mobile at the cost of lowering his damage. This makes it less viable as a straight up frontline killing tool than stock. It allows it to flourish as a flanking roamer soldier weapon, or as the rare soldier combo tool. Starting from the top, the additional rocket per clip is actually huge. Soldier lives and dies by his clip, and even if you're not able to secure the kill with all 5 rockets, you're still putting out enormous pounding pressure on the enemy. 5 rockets coming your way can be an intimidating and difficult thing to contend with, and with their faster projectile speed on top of that, the Liberty Launcher can allow you to hammer enemies with attacks that are simply too fast and numerous for them to counter. On the flank specifically, this thing can pretty handily match most enemies you'll run into. On top of that, the additional rocket combos exceptionally well with the reduced self-damage. It really enhances the speed and amount of jumps you're able to perform in your rollouts, and increases the amount of attacks you'll be able to fire after a rocket jump to bomb in. This makes you a real menace on the flank. The additional rocket all around is a really huge stat, and actually causes this weapon to have only a slightly lower per clip DPS than stock, with even the faster projectile speed also somewhat cushioning it. If you're landing every rocket from a comfortable range, you're not missing out on too many important damage damage thresholds. This is obviously very game state dependent though, as you won't be in a position to fire and land your entire clip from the perfect medium range every time, but it is something to consider. One additional perk this weapon has is its utility as a combo tool. I'm not personally too into this, as I prefer to run a banner as my soldier secondary, but if you're apt to run the reserve shooter or panic attack, the Liberty Launcher can facilitate some very satisfying combos where you deal a bunch of damage to an enemy or pop them up in the air and then blast them with your secondary. Again, not really my thing, but totally worth trying. Now, all of these upsides are really strong. Again, they're some of the objective best stats that a soldier weapon can possibly have. They make every aspect of playing the class easier and more flexible, and augment pretty much all of his basic combat and mobility traits. And yet, it's not a best in slot pick, or even in Soldier's top 3 best primaries, because despite the plentiful bonuses this weapon grants Soldier, he's ultimately a class who's meant to secure kills. And with this weapon, you're basically trying to kill someone with a stuffed sword. The problem with the Liberty Launcher is that Soldier is a damage dealing class. He is not a multitasker or specialist like Engineer or Spy. His primary role on the battlefield is to engage directly with the enemies and secure important picks. I don't play or attempt to speak on the competitive side of things, but I am aware of the whole generalist specialist thing, and the reason that Soldier is considered a generalist is because of his potent mobility and damage dealing. The Liberty Launcher may make the Soldier more mobile and flexible, but if he can't kill people, it really doesn't matter. To go back to the stuffed sword analogy, it's a weapon that you can definitely still attack people with, but requires a lot of hits and effort to secure kills with. Ain't nothing like firing a rocket-propelled grenade at the enemy and dealing 19 damage, or half of a critical rap assassin swing. This thing simply feels really weak and limp at points, and it often feels as though the damage you're dealing and kills you're securing aren't proportionate to the effort you have to put forward for them. The Liberty Launcher makes everything Soldier does easier and more consistent except for killing people, which is inarguably his most important job. It doesn't matter how well you can jump around, how flashy your combos are, or how many rockets you can fire if none of those things are fighting the enemy. Ultimately, the Liberty Launcher is a very fun, rewarding, and mobile weapon that single negative causes it to fall behind other options. It allows Soldier to be much more proactive and aggressive in pursuing kills and chasing enemies, and all around makes him much better at everything except killing people. Even if it has an amazing lineup of positives, I can't help but qualify this weapon for this video because its single negative stat completely nullifies them. It's not the worst rocket launcher and definitely not among the worst weapons in the game, but it is most certainly at the very least held back by one stat. If the damage penalty was slightly more lenient, maybe 15 or 10% with like a splash range penalty, but the exact same positives, I think this thing could be a real contender. But as is, it's definitely fun, but not a serious consideration at most points. Give me better Liberty or give me death. And that's 4 TF2 weapons that are ruined by one stat. I noticed that a common theme among them is that none of them are like bottom of the barrel garbage terrible, and are all just kind of comfortably mediocre.
Mediocre?
The Classic and Ambassador are probably the worst weapons I discussed, and both of them are still quite usable by all accounts, and I have trouble calling either of them the worst options in their respective slots. I think this is ultimately a testament to the nuance of balancing TF2 weapons, that it's often not a singular stat that makes the worst weapons in the game, and is instead often a combination of bad positives and worse negatives. As for the weapons we discussed here, they're all fringe novelties, but are all still very fun to use. At the end of the day, that's all that matters. In the words of our immortal god, Frank Reynolds,
look, I quit on that shit. You understand? I quit on it. I don't give a rat's ass about class. I live on the fringe. Fringe class is where I am.
Okay, great. Thanks, hope you all have a fantastic day before, during, and after watching, and I'll catch you all later. Cheers.